we have some beautiful snow coming down. I had to run out there and do a Facebook Live as if we've never seen snow before, but for some reason it was just beautiful today.
Okay, we are ready to go.
All right, well, thank you. And everyone, welcome to the January 19th meeting of the Operations Work Group. We have no registered speakers tonight, and we did not receive any written comments. So we're going to jump right into approval of the minutes. I move to approve the minutes from the Operations Work Group meeting dated October 12th, 2020. Can I get a second?
Second, Nikki Vandermeulen.
All right, all those in favor, raise your hand, say aye. Any opposed? Motion carries 7-0. We will jump into business now. We have a full agenda tonight. Our main agenda item is to launch our budgeting process for the coming school year. Following that, we will be looking at an attachment-detachment proposal with the DeForest Area School District, and then we will be getting an update on handbook negotiations, particularly regarding the surplus process. Before we launch into our budget discussion, I want to say hi to Dr. Jenkins and point out that this is his first full budget with MMSD, which we're really excited about. And in honor of that, Dr. Jenkins, I'd like to invite you to set the stage by saying a few words.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris, for doing that. And you're exactly right. This is the first budget, full budget cycle I'll go through. And I am just so pleased to have a team that we have as we're looking to build upon the good work that we've already started here in terms of trying to make sure that we're fiscally responsible. We're so thankful to the taxpayers once again for the referendum, the historic $350 million referendum. And as we go into the budgetary cycle, we're going to be looking to a whole study on the promises that we've made to our community to continue to be fiscally responsible, go through the budgetary process with a lens of equity in mind to do the best that we can for all of our students here in Madison Metropolitan School District. So I am really excited. And I have to say that our CFO has started with our team, making sure that we're all well aware of where we are with the budget timelines, but also being very open to the things that we need to do to be bold as we move forward, to kind of rethink some things. So I'm looking forward to that and working with you in operational work group, as well as working with Ananda in the instructional work group as we're moving forward with our instructional piece, knowing that our instruction will lead our work. Everything else is to support what we do for our children. So thank you so much for giving me that opportunity to open up.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins, for helping to set the stage in a way that really captures both the responsibility and the opportunity of each year's budget cycle. Tonight's presentation and everybody's feedback on that presentation is going to provide the foundation that Kelly's going to use to build the budget. So tonight's presentation, even though for the most part there are no immediate urgent decisions we have to make about what we're going to spend on stuff, we need to give Kelly some guidance so that she can go and prepare proposals for us to consider over the next 3 months. So the feedback you provide tonight is really important, and also the questions you ask for clarification will help us set the stage for a smooth budget process moving forward. So in tonight's presentation, there's going to be a few pause points, and I thought I'd outline those so you know where we're going to stop and ask for feedback. The first one will be following our discussion about Kelly's presentation of the goals and the principles that we're using to build our budget on. We'll take a second pause after Kelly's presentation on revenue and enrollment. A third pause after we talk about strategy for the coming year, specifically around compensation, benefits, and equity. And finally, we'll pause at the end of the budget presentation for any final questions or comments. And then we're going to move into a presentation and brief discussion about Title I for the coming school year. So that's a bunch to keep in mind, but please try to hang on to your questions until we get to those pause points. All right, and with that, I will invite Kelly to start her presentation. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you, Chris. And Melissa, if we could pull up the PowerPoint slides, we'll go ahead and dive right in. That would be fantastic. And thank you, Superintendent Jenkins, for kicking us off. We are all here and excited to start the 21-22 budget cycle. It's hard to believe it's January already, and we'll be working together on this budget between now and October, with the majority of our work happening between now and June, like we would in a typical budget year. Melissa, I don't think I have access to drive the slides.
That's okay. Just tell me when to go ahead.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask you to keep pace with me. I'm gonna cover the first couple of ones pretty quickly.
Okay.
So we always kick off our budgeting process by really putting the strategic framework of the district first and foremost. And that is because in alignment with our educational equity policy, we intend to spend all of our resources in line with achieving academic outcomes for students. As a mission, every school will be a thriving school that prepares every student to graduate from high school, college, career, and community ready. And this means we look at every investment that we make in line with our core values: belonging, excellence, creativity, racial equity, social justice, voice of our students, of our families, and potentially some of the most important work is focus. Identifying the priorities of which we have together in order to move on our racial equity and social justice initiatives and moving accelerated learning forward for students. So I want to take these slides a little bit slower tonight because it's important that you redigest the strategic framework as we think through the focus areas and the guidance that you might give me tonight. In the next slide, in our strategic framework, we have 3 goals. And on our website are where our metrics are and our data that track our progress to these goals. Aligning our investments with where we've seen proven results for students and where research supports investments for students, such as our early literacy strategy, is key to moving the district forward and aligning the resources according to our own policy on the educational equity policy. Together, we also work through our investments and our tools on the senior leadership team and with our principals using our equity tool. So Melissa, I'll have you scroll forward to the equity tool slide for me. The next one. You will all remember the work from last year. Last year, we went through all of our past strategic framework priorities together, kind of in a culminating event of our equity projects of the past. We reviewed them, we validated what was working. What hadn't yet achieved the objectives we were looking for, we made adjustments and shifts in order to really relaunch the budgeting process and any new investments that this new board and this new superintendent make moving forward, particularly with our new operating referendum dollars. So kind of starting with this clean slate as we talk through our new investments moving forward and making sure that those that continue from the past have the proven outcomes and or on the trajectory that we would expect to get to those outcomes. So when it comes to our educational equity policy, the questions you see on this slide are what we ask ourselves when we go through all new investments on our budget. These are the questions we have our department leaders review, answer, validate with the stakeholders of the projects of whom they're intended to focus on. And in the next slide, Melissa. These then are our objectives for tonight. Keeping all of that in mind as we go through the overall review of the budget, we'll cover our approach. Chris just mentioned we're going to pause on our goals and parameters to make sure they're in alignment with the direction of the board. We always do our revenue projections, probably one of the most important pieces of our conversation tonight, to make sure everyone understands the assumptions we're making, which thereby lead to our expenditure strategy and our overall need to balance this budget by the time we hit the June budget book. So your discussion tonight is a guiding for me and my team who are all watching this meeting tonight. And our budget team will digest all of your feedback and work through it by the time we see you again in February. The timeline on the next slide is a timeline similar to what we've done in the past, sticking with some of the approach that has been successful for us in the past. So tonight, if you could go to the next slide, Melissa. We're going to be doing our budgeting goals and guiding principles. and creating that revenue forecast with enrollment. Those top two bullets are incredibly important to us tonight. And then we'll touch on the 4 other bullets, going deeper and validating the staffing plan, compensation plan, new investments in healthcare in the next 2 and 3 months. The timeline on the next slide is a similar timeline that you've seen before. Taking ourselves through a deliberate process of revenue tonight, staffing workbooks. Our summer semester planning will be very important for us this year between the February and March to lock that in. The summer semester will be a more of an investment for us this year to make sure we get students what they need in light of our impacts of COVID-19. By April, we'll get a draft budget out to the community. That budget will have been built based on the feedback we have received to date through all of our feedback sessions, whether it's coming from the operational referendum feedback sessions, our virtual learning survey results, and any other piece of information that we've received from our community and our families in the last year. We are building into this budget process and this thinking today, and we'll revalidate that through the community through April and May before you finalize this budget in June. We will have additional work to do, which will probably come more in the April-May timeframe. That's new for this year. And that'll be what we learn from the states and the feds regarding any new COVID-19 funding. We'll receive additional guidance in the upcoming months. And by April and May, we'll have a better understanding of what our school year will look like when we start for 21-22. So we'll hold for some of that work, but I will address kind of some of the things that we might expect are coming towards the end of this presentation. Probably most importantly, as far as our timeline goes, would be a goal to get a pretty solid budget in place in June. In the last 2 years, due to kind of unknowns at the state level, whether it's an unknown around our biennium or unknown around COVID, we've had a budget in place in June with a lot of open items. We've had some if-then statements filled into our budget approvals in June. This year, I think the goal is not to have to do that, but to do our best to lock this budget in with what we expect to hold pretty tight through October in the June process. We're gonna have a lot of work to do this summer to get ready for students and kids, and I think it'll be good to have this budget really put in place with not as many open items as we have had in the past. The next slide, Melissa. So looking at the budget goals, these are similar to last year and have been updated based on the feedback we've received from the community and you through the budgeting process. So continuing to distribute our resources with a lens of equity through our equity tool and our equity policy, but putting an even more intentional focus on our focus set of priorities and what we heard from the community about focusing on early literacy in particular as a major support coming out of our community through that operating referendum. Total compensation, we always aim to be equal to or greater than what is cost of living or otherwise thought of as inflation. This year, our best estimate that base wage to the max number is 1.2%. It hasn't yet been finalized at the state level, but we're pretty sure it's going to come pretty close to that 1.2%. So using that as a working assumption, and we'll do everything we can to get to that base wage maximum to the number. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And we know how important that is, and also in line with much of the feedback we've received through the operating referendum as well. So the budget goals are what we aim to achieve through the budget. And on the next slide, you see our budget parameters and principles. So the principles are like parameters. They're what we work within, right? The goal is what we aim for, and the parameters or principles are what we work within. So we work within a strategic framework that has been vetted by the community and approved by the board, a focus on early literacy as a key priority coming out of the referendum. We know we have to maintain multi-year long-range perspectives. So we always look at the beginning of each year by thinking about multiple years in the future, what's to come. And this year, maybe even more than ever, we need to continue to think about kind of right-sizing the district in alignment with our enrollment. It'll be a theme for the year that we'll work through together. Safety measures and reopening efforts will continue to be a priority within the parameters of the budget that we work within, knowing that we are still deep in a COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, that conversation and that work will be part of this budgeting process. Stability in schools during a time of kind of loss of enrollment and a lot of unknowns, just in the world that we live in today, will also continue to be a parameter of thinking of which we operate within. And we always build on practices that we've seen promising results from our own schools and within the research community. So moving on to the next slide. Actually, you wanted to pause here, Chris. I'm sorry. So let's take a look at those goals and the guiding principles and see what feedback you might have or any changes we might need to make.
Melissa, can we click on the PowerPoint so I can see everybody? Thanks. I'm not sure where Nikki.
I like the, oh God, I'm working on the volume.
No, the someone is having an echo. Like someone is either watching YouTube. Melissa, are you watching YouTube and on a meeting at the same time?
I am not. Mine is off completely.
Wow. Oh, it got better now.
It seems like it's better, yeah. So
Okay.
Nikki, I saw your hand. Did anybody else have a hand up at this point?
I thought I saw Ali's, but I'm not sure if that was correct or not.
Well,
Saw
Nikki,
it
why
on-
don't you go ahead?
I really like the focus on the early literacy. I think it's a game changer. I've agreed that it's a game changer. Our kids aren't reading under past strategies. I think that's an excellent goal. I also like the commitment to staying as close to or reaching COLA as much as the cost of living and inflation as much as possible. I like that for our SEAs, our BAs, using our equity tool, especially when our security assistants, our BAs, and our SEAs are primarily Hispanic and Black. They often are the last to get promoted. They are often the last to get raises. And I think they need to be recognized for their work. And I always advocate for the teachers, I always will. But this is a way to spread the wealth at the same time. And I think this is a good idea to have a strategy and just put it out there. And probably my favorite part is the going through the equity tool and seeing how it applies and how it doesn't. Prior to this year, we sometimes used it. Actually, prior to last year's budget, we sometimes used the equity tool. We sometimes didn't. If we're going to use it, I think we should use it on everything, personally. And so I think that that's a pretty good step. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
Thanks, Nikki. Ollie?
Ellie, I want to thank you for your agility in moving through the last several cycles of our budget, but particularly our most recent cycles and the cycle we kind of anticipate. I do think often that it is our job to kind of be the stewards of doing what we said we're going to do, right? We asked for a referendum, and now our job is to deliver, to get to work, to fulfill the promises we made in pursuit of those referendums. And I think what you just spoke to very much speaks to the promises we've made as a district and to what we've committed to. I agree with Nikki, the emphasis on early literacy is a really exciting thing to see and an exciting thing to move towards. I think the question I'll have will remain similar throughout this process, which is how are we maintaining kind of a consistent relationship with our goals and adjusting appropriately for COVID-19, right? So it's easy to imagine the emphasis on early literacy in kind of our normal classroom environment. But if we're emphasizing the outdoors and meeting the social emotional needs of students, especially our early learners like my kiddo who, missed a segment of kindergarten and now has done first grade online, how are we going to meet kind of those wraparound needs of students and fulfill our promises to the community, I think is really about flexibility. So can you speak to, I guess, both how we really move along through our plan and also maintain the agility we need to respond to the ongoing nature of this pandemic?
Yeah, in response to the kind of the ongoing agility, it's one of the main reasons I start every presentation when we kick off the budget with a reminder of what our cycle of work is. Because as you might all remember, I'm sure you do, we went through that cycle like 4 different times together last year. Certainly more than I'm ever used to and more than you're ever used to. And I think that's the way we will continue to just need to work together through this budget cycle and going into the fall. We'll put our best, minds together to put the right resources in forefront for kids when we draft that April budget. And things might change for us. And by the time we get to the June budget that you're voting on, we might have gone through that whole cycle again and need to revalidate where we are because of COVID or who knows what else in the universe might change. Guess what? And then we're going to have to do that again by October. And maybe we got to do it again in July because something surprising comes out in the state biennium. And we do it again in October because something else comes out, right? So I think as long as we're all flexible with each other, but remain in this kind of like disciplined way of working, that we'll all stay on the same path, the same page, even if we've got to go back and revisit some previous decisions along the way. We'll keep using the same cycle because it keeps us all on the same page.
And one thing I would add to that is that our continued focus is going to be on the health and safety of our children. And as a part of it, it's also that social, emotional, and mental health. And you heard Kelly speak to the fact that this summer, we're not just looking at expenditures for summer schools, but we're looking at investments. Those investments go multiple ways in terms of what's going to be good for our children socially, emotionally, and creating those other opportunities, as well as the academic piece. Lisa and her team has just done a fabulous job of pivoting many times, and with Jay being there with his department and the things that we're trying to do out in our schools. We were lifted up in New York Times about the work that we're doing at the high schools, but we know that it's a lot more work, even after this COVID-19 is over, that we're going to have to do to capture our students where they are and take them where they need to be. Based on a lot of the research that you're reading, it's saying that students are going to have a learning loss of about 3 years, 3.5 for some, but a social emotional loss is going to be serious. And so Lisa's there, if you wanted to speak more to that piece, Lisa. That's a serious question. And that means our budget and what Kelly is saying, we are going to have to pivot at times the more we learn. So Lisa, you had thoughts on that?
Carlton, thank you for saying that. I do agree with everything that you commented on and would just add that we think that the summer semester strategy, we're calling it summer semester rather than summer school, will actually be an investment that will require a different way of using funds, a different way of staffing, and a new focus both on academics and social and emotional support. And we'll really be counting on our own high quality staff to work with us on that and maintain the relationships that they have with students.
Thank you all so much for speaking to that.
Savion, and then Ananda, and then Gloria.
Thank you. I want to thank Kelly and the finance team for maintaining a level of strategic flexibility during the last budget cycle to be able to adapt no matter which way our unknown variables fell through our whole budget process last year. And I anticipate we'll have to do that this year. Throughout this process, I'll just echo something that Dr. Jenkins has consistently said. You know, as far as a budget as a reflection of our priorities and morals, we're trying to be an anti-racist school district. Will our budget reflect that? So in terms of investing in anti-racist strategies that will improve outcomes for students, whether it's early literacy at the early level or restorative justice at the secondary level, and this social emotional piece throughout. Last week, we heard from our public health experts. Dr. Gregg mentioned that in terms of students just recovering from the social and emotional trauma and isolation that they're experiencing right now will be significant. And so we will have to invest significant resources into the mental health piece for the well-being of our students, as well as compensation. In terms of our Black and Brown staff being compensated fairly, this discussion is also related to another topic that we'll be discussing tonight. And so those will be some consistent themes that I'm looking for throughout this whole budget process, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks, Ananda.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. So I want to start by echoing the gratitude to Callie and the team on the fantastic job on navigating really challenging financial landscape, and then just doing that with such amazingness, sharpness around that work, and getting us through a really complicated referendum. So thank you so much. My thoughts, I really, I wanted to just elevate things that Nikki has said, and Ali and Savian, and I really appreciate Savian grounding on the anti-racism piece of it, because I don't necessarily see it highlighted here. What comes up for me, Kelly, is that for far too long, our district had used poverty as an excuse to really address some systemic racism, and we use poverty as a proxy to like everything that was happening in our district, even though we had plenty of evidence that although poverty was a significant data point that impact many of our students, it was not the sole driver and not the only salient data point. And what I'm worried about is that COVID becomes the new proxy for us to not addressing the things that we need to address. So I know we have talked about how technical our equity policy. By the way, I really appreciate you grounding on the goals and the equity policy. That was extremely helpful. I know we talked about like how to, just to get a little deeper on our equity policy and the technicality around it. For me, what I'm going to be looking at for the next year is really understanding how we're going to address, the systemic impact of another pandemic, right? Like we're talking about racism as one of the pandemics, and now we have COVID. I want to figure out how we're going to get in. And when we talk about systemic racism, we forget that systems are made of people, right? And so when we're trying to address, or become an anti-racist school, where is racism manifest? When those manifestations are happening, who in our district is driving those manifestations, right? And we have a pretty comprehensive data set or data tools in our district, different than 5 years ago or 6 years ago, to really look at and be really courageous about how are we going to address those manifestations very courageously and unapologetic about it. Part of my, I think part of the anxiety around the budget for me is those allocations of resources in a program or programmatic way, but also in continuum strategies or continuum of educational opportunities where those manifestations of oppressions are happening for our students. So thank you so much, Callie, for giving this pause and this time, because I thought it was extremely helpful. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Ananda. Chris, did you have comments at this point?
I do. I think Gloria and
Oh, I'm sorry,
next.
Gloria, you were next.
Yeah, I do, but I'll be after. Thanks.
That's okay, Chris. Thank you. So much of what I was going to say, Savian and Ananda talked about, and that was it was focused on the educational equity tool. I'm glad to see that it's on here, Kelly, and that you've grounded us in this. I know when I first started on the board, this was something that I really continued to ask. And so thank you for listening and adding this to and preparing us for the budget. I just want to just make sure that we continue to use this tool throughout the process, and recognize and showcase when we are using it during the budget process, every step of the way. I think that the frustration for me, and no fault to our administration, is that when we get to finalizing our budget, we somehow seem to forget a lot of times, that we have grounded ourselves in this equity process and tool. Granted, we have many things that we have to consider in our decision-making process. But I really want us to, when we come down to making these tough decisions, that this board will come back to this equity tool and force ourselves to ask ourselves these questions. What data is gathered? Who does this decision benefit or burden? And when we are deciding, right, what we're going to take out of the budget and what we're going to put in the budget. And so I understand that, we have many other things that, is really important in setting our budget. But we have to come out of this budget this time around, since we've made it this far. And not that we haven't, it's just we have sacrificed equity based on other decisions that we've had to make. And so I just want us to continue to ask those questions that are in our equity tool to ground us and to make decisions moving forward. So thank you, Savion and Ananda, for bringing that up. I think that is something that we will have to continue to do. And I think, Kelly, I think it is, and Dr. Jenkins, it is your responsibility to make us accountable for that when we are making final decisions on our budget. Make us accountable and remind us and that we need to center ourselves back on this equity tool. And we also have to remind our community that that's right. We need to, by us talking about it and by you talking about it, it reminds our community where our efforts need to go. And so thank you very much, Kelly and your team for this, and look forward to future budget discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, Gloria. And Chris, you're up next.
Thanks, Chris. And thanks everyone for the comments and for the work that you're uplifting here. Kelly, again, like everyone else, echo just the tremendous job that has been done over the past year to lead us through some very unpredictable times. I would just like to highlight that I think it was really helpful to talk about how we are working within certain parameters with our strategic framework goals, and appreciate the focus on early literacy. And I think keeping in mind the multi-year long range perspective is really important for me. We do these year-long budget cycles, and sometimes I think we don't keep the long-term picture in view as much as we need to, just because of the pressure of doing these year-by-year budgets. So that would be important along the way for me. And then highlighting the stability in the schools and figuring out how to maintain that when we talk about our enrollment numbers, and just talk about the fact that we're operating in still uncertain times and in a pandemic, and how we're going to make that work. Dr. Jenkins, I just want to say I appreciate you talking about how the instruction is going to lead our work, and trying to figure out how we really connect that as we look towards in-person learning, what that will look like when we go back, and how we may maintain a virtual model as we move forward too in years ahead, and what investments are going to be needed to make sure that our instruction is strong with an equity lens. I guess this is probably not the right time to bring it up, but just to throw it out there, I think we somehow need to connect this to our cycles of review and how we are looking at how we're reviewing the work that we're doing in these different plans and how that connects with our budgeting.
Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate that. I want to echo much of the gratitude that's already been expressed, both for the challenges that went and work that went into the prior year's budget and all of this foundational work for this year's budget. There's, like many people have said, there's a lot to be excited about already just in this short presentation, particularly the focus on early literacy for me, the explicit focus on equity, and the commitment to try to work towards full COLA. I'm excited about that. Based on what I've just heard, I do have a couple of suggested tweaks to the language of the goals and the principles. On the slide about 2021-22 budget goals, I wonder, let's see, is that the one I was thinking about? Is the goals of the principles? Yeah, I wonder if in line with these board approved policies and our commitment to being an anti-racist district, I wonder if we should actually call that out in the preamble there. Mm-hmm. I think that might just help us every single time we sit down to work on this budget, hold that at the forefront and keep that in our hearts. I really, really appreciated what Ollie said about agility. I actually think in the coming school year, our ability to have stability is going to depend on our agility, if that makes any sense. Like, we're going to need to go back in person, and at the same time, we're going to have kids who are going to need us to be able to provide them with a virtual option. We may need to do more stuff outdoors at the beginning of the school year. Like, we have to be able to respond to whatever the world throws at us. So I'm wondering if we need to put the word agility into the statement about stability. To ensure stability in schools through agility, during a time of great uncertainty, just to capture the need for us to, not only our internal work, but also in our schools to be agile and responsive. And one other tweak I just thought about in the guiding principles, I really, really appreciated your lifting up the fact that we value focus in MMSD. And I wonder if instead of building on practices that are showing data-supported promise for the future, we might want to say that we want to focus on practices that are showing that data-supported promise. I don't know, what do people think about that? Any concerns? Nikki, I see your hand.
I like the first two, not sure on the last one. Could you elaborate slightly on the last one?
To me, saying focus instead of build actually communicates a bit more intentionality about choosing, not only just building on practices that work, but being thoughtful about making decisions about which practices are showing the best results. So that's why I suggested that change, just to indicate intent on the part of the board and the administration working as a team to really invest in what's working best for our kids in alignment with our goals around equity and anti-racism.
That does make a lot of sense, but I don't want to be the only one who weighs in on that one.
Chris?
Yeah.
I think it's a yes and. I think you have to intentionally focus on those strategies showing results instead of just focus, because we want to intentionally continue to build on things that's showing results. Because if you just focus on them, we don't want to have a budget that's not connected. Chris mentioned earlier about having a long view, and that's our hopes. We want to take the long view, and each year we should continue to build on things, but be very intentional about it. So intentionality, that was great to bring that piece in. You have to intentionally focus on those. And that's just my thought on it.
Maybe what we want to say is intentionally build instead of focus. Would that work?
Yes, for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to add that. So thank you, Superintendent Jenkins. And a build was meant to signal programs, let's say like our mental health BHS in schools have been working very well, right? Have proven results. And we know we couldn't implement it in 13 schools overnight. So we've been building over time towards our goal of having clinics, the BHS clinics in schools that needed it the most as a targeted equity strategy. So building over time, our 4K strategy will over time look and feel that way too, right? We're building So I'm totally on board with the change in wording. Just thought I'd kind of add to why we originally used the word build.
Thanks. I feel like intentionally building absolutely captures our value of focus. So
Right. And just one other thing on your words.
Mhm.
When you're mentioning, and I've been saying since I've been here, we say we're anti-racist district, right?
Mhm.
And I continue to ask, are we? I don't think that language that we're adding is intentional enough. I think people are saying it, cliches pretty much now. We're going to be anti-racist. Are we? Are we really? And then I think we should signal that we're going to be continuous learners and doers. You know, something, it needs to become stronger than just we're going to be an anti-racist district. Are we or not? And so I think that was great to add it in. But if we're going to add it in, let's be real about it and not just talk about it. What are we committing to when we say anti-racist? Because that's deep work, that's serious work. And that's also policies is where it happens. We're going to intentionally take our policies and ensure that they are anti-racist as we're implementing them. You know, that was just my only thought about anti-racist. Otherwise, I don't know if it's anything other than just another word.
Yeah, I'll add if the document is anti-racist, it'll be inherent.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with not adding the words anti-racist and just trying to ensure that everything that's in our budget reflects that value as well. So
I'm not saying to take it out. I'm just saying we need to reinforce it if we're going to do it. That's all.
yeah, I agree with you. Like by putting it there, I hope it forces us to be constantly thinking about that.
Mm-hmm.
How do we actually put those words into action in the budget and in our policies? Anything else on goals and principles before we move on to revenue? Gloria?
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, I'm like trying to.
That's okay. Yeah.
I'm like this. So just to go off that, I mean, I think, and Kelly, maybe you can help us or somebody on the staff, like there has to be I really want to drill this down, right? Because I think how do we practice this, right? As Dr. Jenkins says, right, it is like we say anti-racist, right? But like, what is it? What does it look like in our budget? Like, and how do we like just really drill down to this, right? In our budget. And so it's so easy to say that, we have this equity tool and we're anti-racist and our budget is going to be, reflect that. But what does that process look like for the board in the board process, right? Like, I just want us to really drill that down to our work as a board, because like I've said before, something will come up, right? Something will come up in our community where our community is asking for this, but it's contrary, it contradicts where we want to go, right? So that we can become more of an anti-racist school district and using our equity tool, right? So I want us to, like, how do we compare that to make sure that every time we are in a budget discussion about something, that we directly, that process forces us to directly look at the equity tool and what does anti-racism look like. And I think that we need to, as a board, anytime we have those conversations around budget, we need to ask ourselves that, like, there has to be a formality worked within our process, because otherwise, I'll be gone, Ananda Ali, Savion may be gone someday, Chris Carusi, Nikki may be gone someday, right? It is, how do we practice this? And how do we put it in place as part of our process so that when we leave for the next generation, the next, that it is fixed. Obviously things will change, right? I mean, hopefully we won't have to talk about being an anti-racist school district because we have arrived. But, you know, it's just, I know I'm talking too much about this. I just feel like I don't want to lose sight of this process as we are, as we continue to do this work. So a formality and process to force us to talk about this stuff particularly during budget, because we always talk about, you know, how do we make sure that our budget reflects our values, right? And this is one of our values, and we need to make sure it's reflective.
I happen to agree with Gloria on this, but I think it's being taken care of with Ali's and what we did with the agility of the budget. The fact that we're being nimble and willing to go back as many times as needed, and the fact that the statement is in there with the equity tool. Before we did openly state, we would use the equity tool every time. And when we did, we were not specific on how it was used. And that was our biggest fault. I think now we actually have a way to do that. The fact that we can be that agile, combined with the fact that we have the tool and already committed to using the tool, I think will be a reminder. I'm not saying it could solve 400 years of racism. Nothing can do that, except for hard work, hard work, hard work. But at the same point, I do believe it helps us live our values better by allowing us to pivot when we need to. Say, okay, this is what the community says. They want new, they want shiny, but these are the goals we're committed to. By just looking and reading what our goals as written are, when we're openly saying we are intentionally going to do this, I mean, that says I got to do it. It doesn't say maybe. It doesn't say if there isn't a problem. It says I have to do it. In law, we have shall and we have may. Shall means must, may means you can. That, to me, this is shall. We have to.
Kelly.
I guess I have a commitment and a potential proposal for your consideration, of which does not need to be decided tonight. The commitment that I will make is as we go through the new investment process, which will be that March and April timeframe in particular, that our departments have done and are finishing up on some very good work as it relates to filling out kind of the equity tool for any of the new investments. We'll be sharing that with you and bringing that into the course of the conversation around why are these the right investments for this time and in line with our anti-racist commitments. My proposal to you is potentially one way to get at what you're thinking, Gloria, is when we go through what tends to be the amendment process or looks and feels like the budget amendment process in the May and June timeframes, that we ask board members to complete the tool. You know, we can support with data along the way, but that the board members themselves have never completed the equity tool as it relates to budget amendments. Potentially, that's my proposal, is that that's something new we could try for this year if the board is in support.
Savian?
Yeah, one parting thought on this is that it's great that we have the equity tool, but ultimately a process is a culmination of human decisions. And if we get to a point where someone's advocating for something that isn't anti-racist, it's on us as leaders to say no.
Yes, in a perfect world, yes. But the budget decisions that I have been a part of, not so much. I mean, I think we have to, I think what Kelly is proposing, I think is a really good, I think it really does force us, Savian and others, you know, to really build it into our process. And so that, you know, as we rotate out of our terms or we change, I mean, this board has, you know, set some precedent around using a process, just like any other process that we have that have been sort of, you know, given to us And so we're just tweaking it a little bit. So yeah, I mean, I think as leaders, we have to make tough decisions, right? But I think that as we are making these tough decisions, I think making our community understand where we stand on these issues, and have a transparent process about how we make these decisions, I think will help us and our community understand.
Just have a quick question, Gloria, if I may, to Gloria's, Chris.
Go ahead.
And that is, I'm fine with that as long as I have access to the data. I've had a lot of times prior to this where I couldn't get the data because I don't want to overwhelm Kelly. I don't want to overwhelm the system. If I could get the data to do it, I'll be glad to do it. But sometimes I don't always have it. So as long as we can commit to that, I'm good with it.
I would add on the notion of the equity tool for budget amendments. I'm supportive of giving that a try. I think we need to evaluate how it goes after we give it a try. And part of me thinks that sounds like a really great way to maintain a focus on equity, and part of me worries that the tool itself might be cumbersome enough that it might prevent good amendments from coming to the table. So I would want to make sure that that's the right tool to ensure that our amendments are in line with our equity goals. And if it's not, then we need to start thinking about what else we might do. But let's give it a try and see how it works. Chris?
And I was just thinking that amendment process is at the very, very end of the budget cycle. So the bulk of the budget isn't necessarily done through amendments, at least from my perspective. If we're doing our budget correctly, we shouldn't have a lot of amendments at the end. And so whatever we can do and figure out to operationalize what Gloria is saying earlier in the budget process, I think will help us.
All right. Well, I think what we should do now is move into revenue, and
Ali has her hand up.
Ollie, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ollie, and then we'll move into revenue.
You're both on mute. You're all on mute.
Ollie, you're muted.
Sorry, I want to acknowledge something that Gloria was saying, which is that, we have to have a long-term commitment. And I think what Kelly was saying, I think using that tool and embodying these approaches as a board makes that tool transparent and relevant to our entire community, right? It's the way that we elevate our process publicly and examine not only the entire district, but ourselves as board members. And I think that we have to push ourselves to do that. I think that's part of what Sabian was speaking to in saying that our budget is a moral document, right? And part of the ethics of engaging with that document is doing so transparently. So if we're gonna, pursue anti-racism beyond kind of the rhetoric of anti-racism, but really, where the rubber meets the road and what we're investing in. I think, Kelly, you're giving us a great opportunity to utilize that tool and refine that tool, and also give our community a chance to give us feedback on our approach to equity and anti-racism. So I'm excited to tweak the process in this way, and I appreciate this conversation deeply.
All right, let's move on to revenue.
All right. Melissa, if you could pull the slides back on up. Thank you very much for that great conversation. I can't tell you how much I appreciate hearing your voices and your deep thinking early in this process, so we can keep coming back to it through each iteration of the budget. So moving on to revenue. Now is the pretty key time to understand what assumptions we're operating for revenue from the year, as that's what we need to balance too. A couple of big moving parts with our revenue that require some pretty big assumptions. The first one is that we are entering a new biennium at the state level. That will be a budget for 21-22, the budget which we're creating now, and a budget for 22-23, because the state gives us a 2-year budget. That budget is due in June from the state, really by law. However, we've seen through the last 2 budget cycles coming out of the state with the kind of really deep bipartisan divide at the state level, that we have not received our budgets by June, and we were into July before we received those budgets. So to Lee's point around kind of remaining flexible with the unknowns, our revenue is very likely to stay truly unknown through and until July, meaning the board will very likely need to vote on this budget without those revenues truly being known. So that needs to be something we're kind of all comfortable with if we're not going to be doing budgeting over the summer, and if we want the June budget to be our main budget. So keeping that in mind, our revenue limit is probably going to be pretty limited this year. And we see that coming from multiple different pieces of evidence, which is the reason why we're putting $100 per member kind of estimate in there, an assumption for this 21-22 budget. For one, being in a COVID environment and kind of inflation really being hampered down this year, there's not going to be a ton of data support behind a large revenue limit increase. In addition to that, we see a number of state entities really signaling for a lower revenue limit this year. The DPI requested for $150 per member in their budget that they released. And almost never, right, does DPI get everything that they want. So we know we're going to be south of 150. That's a maximum. And what we know is that the Republicans are going to work to negotiate that down. Robin Voss is already on record saying that that's never going to happen. So coming out with $100 per member estimate is probably about the highest we're gonna get out of negotiations. Could come in a little bit lower. But coming in at this estimate gives us a little bit more flexibility for this year. We saw 179 in a pre-COVID world. So 100 is probably about where we'll be. It could be 0 and it could be negative. During Act 10, we saw a negative number and had to take severe cuts over August and September. After we received our budget. So no option is off the table in what might happen in negotiations at the state level, but putting in $100 per member estimate is probably the best we're gonna do. And a state per pupil categorical aid, as a reminder on the difference here, the revenue limit is property taxes. It's what we're told by law we can increase taxes above our base, multiplied by the number of students that we have. The state per pupil categorical aid, though, is different. That's direct funding from the state. This is a tool that Governor Walker put in place when he wanted to limit the revenue limit and keep property taxes artificially low. That has not really been a tool used since the beginning of the Walker administration and or in an election year. So we're likely expecting to get zeros out of the categorical aid pool. We're not expecting that the state's going to have a lot of extra funding that they're going to put towards the categorical aid versus general aid. Categorical aid is really an equal investment into schools. It takes no account for equity versus the general aid pool, which has a little bit more sensitivity into the formula to be a little bit more equitable than the categorical aid is. So we would assume that if there's kind of money to be investing in education, we could potentially see a general aid pool increase, which I'll talk about in a minute, but probably not on the categorical aid side, which is a per pupil formula coming out of state funds. So putting a $0 estimate in there. And then we have our revenue authority. Thank you to our local taxpayers. For the 21-22 year would be the $8 million, or the second year of the revenue authority we were provided. Key to all of this, when you see per member, what that means is multiplied by a member, which is a student. A member is a formula that's built into the state law. With a lot of adjustments, it's relatively a student. So when we look at the next table or graph here in the slide, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead one slide. I did just mention the per pupil categorical aid has been incredibly unstable, and being that we're not in an election year right now and with COVID-19 continue to expect to see the lack of stability in the revenue limit in the categorically. In the next slide is the membership average I was just referring to. So what we see are some compounding factors on this 3-year membership average. So this means the number of students we have here in Madison that are appointed to Madison Metropolitan Schools averaged over the 3 years is the number we get to charge for the revenue. We have seen declining birth rates here in Madison for a number of years now, and this board has talked about that well since COVID-19, that our incoming classes have become smaller due to fewer houses holding a larger number of kids here in Madison, just due to lower birth rates coming out of the last recession that have been in our elementary schools and moving up through and into middle schools. Then you compound that lower birth rate with our 2X charters that we're now 3 to 4 years into those implementation cycles. The good news is because we're 3 or 4 years in, it's now affecting the full 3-year membership count, which is good news for us. But we've had a new 2X charter join the school district. So layers in additional student loss to the 2X charters, and you see that in the orange bar there. Then you layer in COVID-19. So where we would have seen slightly declining enrollment in 2020, 2021, and again in 21, 22, we now see bigger loss of enrollment due to the effects of COVID-19. We have pulled our second Friday counts. They are not finalized yet. DPI finalizes that through a process. That data was just submitted a week or so ago. And what we're seeing is no major shifts in enrollment from second Friday counts, no major increases in a relatively stable loss of a few students kind of across the district since the September count. Which means our assumptions kind of going into the revenue calculating process for next year really can heavily rely on those second Friday counts and on the third Friday September counts into our enrollment projections, since there were no kind of major new news coming out of second Friday. Moving into the next slide, you saw this slide back in November. This is a slightly different look than the membership count at our students and seats projections. This is what Andrew takes to project the number of students on a school by school basis, where the membership really looks over district, 3-year average, projects revenue out. This really projects our staffing file that we need based on our projected enrollment for last year. So when we met back in November, and when I break in a minute, Andrew is on in case anyone has any questions. But when we met back in November, we agreed to make some assumptions around 4K and K. That assumption was that we will likely be getting many of those students back, because kind of thinking that they were more redshirted versus in other districts. And then we adjusted the enrollment projection grades first and up based on a new trend. Not assuming that the full COVID-19 effect was in play, but that some of that effect would continue. And all of that was predicated on the assumption that we would be back in person for 21, 22, and not further drive loss of enrollment due to being in virtual learning. So with those assumptions all in play, we then went and did a survey to our families whom have left the district for the 2021 school year. Andrew's team did a great job, and our school secretaries did a fabulous job of reaching individual families and asking them about their individual decisions. There are slides in the appendix regarding that survey, but the main point I will touch on here is that what we're hearing from our families is that most of them have moved, and they're not actually in Madison anymore, and therefore are not likely coming back. Those who are in Madison are largely either undecided at this point in time or may not be coming back to the district based on what they're telling us today. They've found a new home and they may not be coming back. So at this point, sticking with the enrollment projections that we put together in November for the budgeting process is what we plan on doing without making any assumption changes about more families coming back, because of the data that we receive from our leaver survey. So if our projections are within the kind of 1% accurate that we're used to being, and we're calculating in our 3-year membership, this is going to affect our overall revenue estimates. And on the next slide, you'll see that. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through this. So bear with me, and I'm okay if I have to, repeat this multiple times through multiple presentations. Overall, we're projecting a revenue limit increase of $0. How that is calculated is we now have 26,000 kids in the district instead of 27,000, roughly. Enrollment loss of that 1,000 students at our rate per pupil that we could put onto property taxes generates a loss of $7 million for the school district. However, if we get $100 per pupil back out of the revenue limit, that's going to give us about $3 million back. And at that point, we believe we will trigger at the state level what's called the declining enrollment exemption of about $4 million. So you add those 3 things together, and it becomes kind of a $0, no new revenue coming out of the revenue limit. Categorical aid, I just discussed a minute ago, assumptions coming in at a $0 change. And then we have the $8 million thanks to our local taxpayers coming from the revenue limit, really tied to those discussions we had with the community around investing in excellence and equity overall for the school district. So in all, that's an $8 million new revenue, which is less than we certainly would have predicted back in July. At a mill rate assumption, I like to put that out there now, so we're kind of clear and transparent through the community. We're making an assumption at this point in time that we'll be using our entire revenue limit due to the constraints coming out of the enrollment loss, that we would use the whole referendum to exceed of $8 million. If we continue to lose on equalization aid at about 10% this year, and if property value growth slows down due to COVID-19, you could see a mill rate of about $11.36 to $11.48, kind of being in the range of where we might be by the time we hit October. And there is a lot of things that can change between now and October, including our equalization aid could look much better. We know that TPI is asking for a larger pool available to school districts. That might help us. And as a reminder, we actually got some aid last year, so we could potentially reverse trends and get more aid this year. And that'll bring that mill rate right down. In addition to that, Madison's been trending 5 to 8% of property value growth. So a 1 to 2% is a pretty conservative estimate here in Madison. So if we outpace that, mill rate will come right down as well. So looking at this as it should be almost a worst case and start to improve if some of these numbers start to move in our favor. So that is revenue. Did you want to pause at this point, Chris?
Sure, we could use this as our pause point. So feedback that I think is important to get to Kelly at this point, hopefully from everybody, is are you comfortable with the assumptions that Kelly has made about local taxpayer and state support, enrollment, and probably to a lesser degree equalized property value? But the big thing is the assumptions about state revenue and enrollment. Because if you're not comfortable with those, then Kelly might have to change path a little bit. So, Nikki.
I am comfortable with it. I think that being conservative here happens to be for the better, because frankly, there are things we don't know. I still believe we need to fund our strategic equity, and I still believe we need to fund our staff, but on the assumptions, I'm very, very comfortable with that, because I don't think we could guarantee on the state revenue on anything with the way this government is currently, and with the amount of changes that are occurring. Plus COVID, I don't think anyone could predict it.
Thanks, Nikki. Savian, would you like to go next, or?
Yeah, I am comfortable. This is something we discussed last year with the budget, is that it's much easier to build up and commit to new things rather than decommit. to things. So I'm comfortable building this up kind of from the ground up or from the lowest possible assumptions.
Chris, and then Ollie.
Yeah, I had a kind of a specific question. Kelly, I'm wondering, is the declining enrollment funding that you explained, is that a one-year adjustment or is that something that happens over multiple years?
Well, it's a 1-year adjustment for the total $7 million. We received a couple million of that last year as the first kind of trigger of the declining enrollment exemption. This $4 million is the first time of this $4 million. It is probably the largest we'll receive into the future. We could trigger $1 million or $2 million next year, depending on how the numbers all look. So it's one time, and that you only get this $4 million once. You don't get it multiple years. But when trends continue, you can kind of layer a little more, but it will get smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's the purpose of it. It's not to protect the district forever. It's to gradually help the district resize itself over a 3-year period.
Okay, that makes sense. And I obviously would like to not have that be a continuing trend, the declining enrollment. And I guess that's one of my questions is, one of the assumptions this is built on is that COVID will not have an impact on the enrollment for 2021-22. And I'm just sort of curious if you could explain a little bit more what that assumption is built on.
Yeah, Andrew, do you mind jumping in here? If not, I'll do it.
There we are. So I would first of all say that yes, we share the value that we are kind of conservative in our projections for enrollment because they do have such severe impacts on the budget when you go way off track. So we have definitely baked that in as a value. Now, making assumptions around the impact of COVID-19 as it relates to in-person instruction, unless there is a strong signal that something like this would continue, we have gone with the assumption that the disincentives that were present as it relates to COVID-19 are certainly not worse for later grades. I think the real question is how it plays out for 4K and for kindergarten, because we are making an assumption that the one-time reduction for 4K and kindergarten is driven by COVID-19. So what we're hearing anecdotally from some of our families with younger students is when it is safe to reopen, we will join you. So there's definitely a willingness of that community to join us for in-person instruction. So that's the assumption that we have built in, is that we would have a one-time event. Since we first made that projection and built that kind of assumption in, we have then had emerging evidence that younger students are less likely to transmit the disease or experience severe symptoms from the disease. So it does remain within public health recommendations to phase in earlier grades first. So that would then still suggest that 4K and kindergarten would be joining us at similar numbers, similar historic numbers.
The only other thing I'd add to that, thank you, Andrew, is super helpful, is that our 4K enrollment process is earlier. And so we will have data on our 4K trends by the time the board approves the June budget.
Okay. I guess for me, I would just say that to me, looking at this and how it fits into the budget picture and looking at enrollment just underscores the importance of providing instructional options for families. As we looked at that survey where families were sort of split, no matter what demographic we were talking to, on in-person versus, just that basic first survey, in-person versus virtual instruction and what families wanted, just continuing to communicate and find out that information for families and being able to provide instructional options for families as we continue to move through the pandemic.
All right, thank you.
I'm sorry. Is this how related is this to our expectations of federal $1 from the federal level?
For COVID funding, well, federal dollars are not in this analysis. Two reasons. One is it's actually a very small percentage of our overall revenue. Maybe three reasons. Two, it's a declining revenue stream. Putting COVID funding to the side for a minute, all of our title streams are shrinking. So it's tends to be a conversation of what are we not going to do, because we haven't received new revenues on the title side. As it relates to COVID, well, the third reason is that federal funding tends to be very, very targeted towards very specific projects or students. So it's not available for general budgeting purposes. We certainly talk through Title I. We're going to talk about that in just a minute, and some of our other titles and how we use those resources across the district through the budgeting process. And as it relates to COVID, we just don't really know enough at this point, but it is a fund that when we receive our 21-22 allocation coming from the state through DPI, will be eligible for COVID related expenses. So we can't just spend it on anything. But to the extent that it will and can align with, for example, our summer semester plans, we will absolutely use COVID funding as a way to help balance that overall budget and overall need where we can and where it aligns.
Chris?
Yes, Dr. Jenkins.
Yes, one thing I just wanted to make sure that everyone is well aware that we know where we are now and trying to predict where we're going in the future. Some of our families have also said that they want an online option. So Chris, to your point a minute ago, we know this from our families. So we're planning for both as we go along, but how much we plan for, that's going to be based upon the surveys that we actually get back with our families. But that's a viable option. Some students who are medically fragile and some students who are excelling doing online, the families are really looking at that as an option.
Thanks for that reminder. Ollie, you've been super patient.
Thanks so much, Chris. I want to start by just highlighting Kelly's point around doing the exit surveys and really looking at what has driven some of our decline in enrollment. And I think looking at moving as a major factor in terms of folks leaving major metropolitan areas during COVID is something we're going to see the long-term effect of and reality of. But I don't think has to, define our next decade necessarily, or that we have, that we're in a place to determine that will define our next decade for sure at this point. I think asking if we're comfortable with the numbers is such a complex question, Chris, because I think there's like a existential crisis I had around like school funding formula. When you said comfortable, I was like, not the word I would say, but do I think that Kelly's assumptions are accurate and, prioritize our ability to make sound decisions and really balance this budget moving forward? Absolutely. I think looking at the folks who did the exit strategy or the exit polling, I want to thank Andrew's team. I also really appreciate, Kelly, that you gave a shout out to our secretaries for reaching out to individual families. I think so often folks are like, what are people doing during this pandemic who were doing, really specific roles? And I think it just highlights that we are utilizing our entire team to meet the needs of families, to inform our district, and that there's so many people going above and beyond the normal expectations of their role to allow for us to make sound decisions. And so I want to thank folks for doing that work. I think that there's going to be a lot of factors to take into consideration as we move through the spring. And I do think it's important that we really have our fingers on the pulse of, I guess, the worst case scenario. And so I think that this being a place to start, hopefully not where we land, but being a place to start is the right thing to do.
Ananda.
Yeah, I thank you so much, Kelly. I think the projections make sense, and I really appreciate you walking us through very detailed, and appreciate the narrative that is going around the conversation as well. Thank you.
Gloria, did you have anything to add?
Nope, I don't.
Kelly, I would affirm that I feel pretty comfortable with your assumptions. I don't think there's a chance that Evers would not he wouldn't let through a budget that had a $0 revenue limit increase. I think he would veto it. So I think your $100 assumption is pretty safe. I am curious if you could give us an update on what has happened with the special education aid that was built into this year's budget that I think we went ahead and assumed in our budget that we wouldn't get it.
And we didn't.
Okay.
So it's a tricky conversation. Certainly from a political standpoint, a percentage increase sounds fantastic. So you are seeing in the DPI request, and you'll see continuing through the budget negotiations at the state level, increasing pushes for the percentage in for special education reimbursement to increase. However, you only receive that if you really spend the money, and a good portion of our special education budget goes to transportation. So because we didn't have any special education transportation expenses kind of coming through the spring, there was zero way to collect on any additional percentage, and that's statewide, right? So when we see our budgets start to move back to looking a little more normal in the next year or two, you may start to see some increases. But at this point, I don't think we'll see those until 22, 23, even if we get anything through in this budget cycle, which I hope we do, right? I hope we get those increases and eventually the funding will start to come to us, but it's like a year lag increase in the really low transportation expenses for the special education with just our revenue reimbursement for last year and for this year. It just isn't going to be there. But by 22, 23, I'm hoping things will be back to normal. We'll be back to a trend, and we'll actually start to see some of the revenues that were anticipated.
Thanks. I also just wanted to echo my appreciation of the Lever survey. That was really helpful information. And I'm hoping that that can become part of the new normal, like not just be a COVID thing. It would be great if we could do a similar survey every year to get a better understanding of why people are out leaving MMSD and the strategies we can take as a board to try to increase our enrollment. Like, what are we looking at doing to keep families here and maybe attract families to move here? So thank you very much to the team for doing that and sharing those results. All right, Kelly, I think we can move ahead.
All right, Melissa, if you could pull the slides back up. We're gonna start to dive into some budget strategy side of the house. So on the next slide, that $8 million in revenue is the $8 million we just talked about in the previous slide. So that's our kind of anticipated new revenue, entirely coming from the referendum at this point. So with that revenue projected, and if we were to, invest in what we all know are our priorities, including investing in our staff, who we know are working very hard during virtual learning now, and will continue to serve our students next year, a full and compensation plan with steps and base wage to the max at 1.2% would give you a $7.6 million investment. Employee benefits, healthcare, $2.6 million based on the projections from what you all approved for a 3 to 4 year healthcare plan in last budget cycle. Our equity and excellence investments at $4+ million kind of a working goal at this point with the team. And then every year we have required allowances is 1.5 million. We usually budget 2 million there, but we're gonna try to stay within a $1.5 million range, limiting only what we really must do by law, which then altogether would produce what we'll call a revenue gap by $7.7 million. Revenue meaning we don't have enough revenue to fund overall what the needs and the wants of the school district and the board would be to invest in all of our areas of interest. So we are not in a budget crisis. We have strategies available to us. What it means is that if these are our priorities, and of course there's priorities within priorities, particularly as it relates to our new investments, we'll spend a good amount of our time looking at how to balance this budget over the next couple of months to make the left side of the equation work. And so that will include kind of restructuring the district in alignment with our new size. So as enrollment moves, so do our staffing plans, both at schools and at central office. So we'll be looking at some enrollment shifts at the school level in line with our class size policy, and at central office to a tune of $4 to $5 million. So that's a lot of work to evaluate. We've got a principal advisory group in place that we've started to work through those estimates with. That comes back to you all in February. And in addition to that, just like we always do, sweeping our budgets, analyzing what's working, kind of what's not working, to identify the remainder of what we need to balance the budget. So that includes those interest rates I talked about with good news just last week. We're finally starting to see some savings out of utilities for our environmental sustainability investments that we've made. So there'll be a little savings there we can take. Considering the year that we're going into, I think it's safe to look at like food and travel budgets, since I don't think we'll be back to a normal way of working, being in COVID-19 still in the school year. So we'll look at those. Always looking at central office department budget staffing, and we're going through a process with superintendent check-ins of what we're calling kind of the stop doing list, and whether it's things that we can stop doing to save time, or whether it's things we can do to save resources, kind of a new way and a new process that we're trying out this year. So we have strategies to balance this budget. We'll be working to balance the budget. And all of that will come back to you in alignment with funding all of our potential investments on the other side of the paper. The next couple slides, I'm just going to go through really fast because I know Chris wants to have the conversation in whole. We always look at multi-year budgeting. And so I put the two kind of orange boxes in the revenue limit. This is what Ananda just asked me about and the effects that the enrollment will have. Last year, 21, 22, and 22, 23 on our budget, which does start the cycle of lower enrollments well into the future until or unless we do start to gain enrollment back. We add in our referendum authority and then just our expenses assumptions of what base wage might look like, what healthcare might look like, and what other investments might need to look like over the years, just to put a projection in place for the next 4 years as we think through multi-budgeting. Nikki, Chris has asked me to get through the next couple slides and then we'll open it up, but I do see your hand. So the next slide dives into, at a deeper level, salary, our total compensation plan. So steps, of course, the board has available kind of not doing steps. We had that conversation last year, all the way up to fully investing in steps. And that would be at a tune of $4.5 million. Similar for base wage, the board always has its disposal to not do base wage this year. If you went to 1.2%, it'd be a $3.1 million. So looking for your kind of guiding direction on this. But at this point, as I mentioned, we'll keep the $7.6 million in there as our repurposing goal to get to close that overall $7+ million gap that I mentioned a minute ago. On the next slide, in the healthcare world, you all voted back in last spring for a 4.5% maximum increase for GHC and a 6.9% maximum increase for Dean. So that's our starting spot to a tune of $2.6 million. Deirdre, Rochelle, and team are still going through the negotiation process with the healthcare providers, and we'll do everything they can to bring that number down. As that number decreases, that would then help to fill our gap that I just mentioned. So that would be a gap reducing strategy that is certainly well underway. And we'll have good news hopefully for you by March. But at this point, this is our operating assumption until negotiations is over and we can come up and tell you how it went. not anticipating any major changes. Getting back to our conversation around stability in schools right now, we fully recognize that we don't need to rock too many boats around healthcare while we're in the middle of a pandemic right now. Deirdre, did you have anything to add on these two slides before I move on the comp or the healthcare side?
Thanks, Kelly. No, I think you nailed it. I think we're moving forward, like you said, with the healthcare negotiations, and we only anticipate it being positive for us going forward.
All right, thank you. And then the last two areas that we're really looking at for budgeting strategy around equity and excellence actions. This is where I mentioned earlier, kind of a commitment to you that will bring forward the department's really good work around using the equity tool for any new asks on this budget. Areas of focus remain early literacy, kind of and beyond, looking at the secondary reading as well. Our mental health investments, social emotional learning, Ali mentioned earlier, and accelerated learning is a heavy focus for us. Summer semester being one of the larger items that's likely to come forward for new investments for this year, and using COVID money where we can for that as well. Welcoming and safe schools goes to this board for discussion. Coming up here in a meeting soon, coming out of the safety committee, but this is where the restorative justice piece would be, Savion. I know you mentioned that earlier as well. So it would fit into that fourth area. So these are some of the bigger focus areas. Again, trying to remain really tight and focused with our investments, and trying to keep those required allowances as minimal as possible. But this is where your open enrollment effects come in at the required allowances. This is where the 2X charters and some of those impacts that are at this point largely out of our control that we just need to fund will go. So that's really where we're at with budget strategy. Chris, if Lisa, do you have anything to add before we open it up?
No, Kelly, I think you hit it on the head. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. That was great. Dr. Jenkins, before we launch into this discussion, I'm wondering if you would be willing to help us kind of frame the conversation we're going to have. I really don't want to dive too deep into the weeds at this point, because we have time on the agenda over the next 3 months to really dig into budget strategy and where we're going to invest. And at the same time, I'm wondering if you might be willing to say a few words in particular about the stop-do list that Kelly mentioned, as well as your perspective on compensation and equity investments, just from a high level to kind of frame people's questions and discussion as we move into this.
Yeah, first of all, let me just say thank you to Kelly and to the team. They've been working hard behind the scenes to get us to this point. When we think about the whole idea in terms of just equity, we really, as a team, I feel like we feel very strong about that, and we're going to push hard with our anti-racist work as we continue to try to define it, but make sure we actualize it as we're going through this particular work. And I think when we're looking at our organization, we want to make sure we're showing strong value for our staff. So when you mentioned the part in terms of looking at the budget and how we're looking at that too, as recognizing when we can and how we can. And I think there's been a lot of strategic thought into how we could push forward, understanding where we wind up this year, but also taking a long view of where we're going next year. So I am one, I think that we come right out knowing that it's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood about 1.2, pretty close to that estimate. And I think that's showing value for our employees, our staff. They have worked incredibly hard. And I know, just talking to all of you, you all value our staff as well. I think let's start off with that and then get to the other discussions that we need to have in terms of moving our district forward. That gets to the stop-do list. And the stop-do list, if you're reading Good to Great and you go in and you're looking at page 143, it's talking about the stop-do list. We always talk about what we need to do next, but what about those things we need to stop? And that goes back to our whole alignment discussion in terms of building on things intentionally that are on those practices that's showing results versus continuing to just put things in our budget because we've always put them in our budget. this is give us an opportunity. So when you're looking at good to great, and I know all of you have your books and you've probably already read it through that chapter, but we have to come up with the stop do list. And I mean, this is a process where it's very collaborative. We sit and we look and we say, are we getting a return on our investment for our children, for our district, and are we upholding our fiscal responsibility in which we said we would do to the community? So that's what that's pretty much about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jenkins. So with that as our frame, do people have comments? I see Nikki and Savian. Nikki, go ahead.
Kelly, the only thing I was going to say was I couldn't see the light blue type. I was having a hard time seeing it.
Okay, noted. Thank you very much. I'll get that fixed for you, Nikki.
Yeah, it's just a vision thing. But to answer your question, I agree with Dr. Jenkins. As close to 1.2 or 1.2 as possible, because our staff is doing above and beyond. And I think that's necessary. Additionally, I don't want to cut anything in mental health. And I do not want to take advantage. Right now, I think we expect so much from our staff that I'm afraid they're getting burned out. I don't know if we can do monetary contributions, day of break, day of some meals, something. Because sometimes I can't imagine in a pandemic trying to teach 10 hours a day on Zoom, for 8 hours a day on Zoom, and working and being socially isolated. So I just want to somehow show we appreciate it, but I don't quite know how to do that, especially, I don't think with our security assistants and our behavior assistants, we say it enough. We just expect that to be done. And I know I forget it a lot. Same with our janitors. Kind of bad at thanking people. So that's just where I'm getting at. So I'd be as close to the one.
Thanks, Nikki. Savian?
Yeah, thank you for those words, Dr. Jenkins. It's certainly a commitment that I believe this board shares. Just a quick question. I know last year we embedded the all-day 4K pilot into the budget. Is it safe to assume those levels are consistent with what we approved last year?
Most definitely, they're consistent, and we're having deeper discussions about how we could even expand that commitment. And Lisa, you want to talk about that? That's pretty serious. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. We are thinking bigger than what we thought before, Savian, and we are finalizing the numbers on that. We are really excited. I knew that you would be too. I saw that smile. And we will be bringing it forth to you over the next couple of months, but we are very excited and committed about that work.
I am excited and looking forward to seeing that come down the pipeline.
Let's see, Chris.
Yeah, I guess one of the questions I had is how we reached that $4 million amount for the equity and excellence actions. I guess one of the things we talked about when we went out into the community and talked to them about the operating referendum, we really highlighted all of the equity projects that we were going to be doing. And so I guess I would like to see, we have 8 million in operating funds coming in, that investment in equity and excellence actions be over half of that. And I'm not exactly sure where that number would fall, but I guess that's something that I would like to see us prioritize, because the things that we had on that list, we know that we need significant investment in all of those, and especially the mental health. We have talked about that a lot in a lot of different areas, and what that investment is going to look like and how much we need, I think should remain as part of our discussion as we move forward. So I guess that's one piece of feedback that I would have. The other question I have, and going back to our cycles of review, I know that we did a number of adjustments at central office this past year to fill gaps that we had in classroom teacher positions and other things that we needed in the schools. I guess I would like, is there a way to have some assessment of the departments that lost staffing along the way and how that is getting replaced, or how we figure out when we're in a sort of a pause in our cycles of review for some of these departments, how we make sure that we have the staffing levels that we need going forward, how we even assess that.
I'll let Deirdre and Lisa maybe jump in on the assessment piece. I'll just say that my assumption as we're building this budget is that for the 21-22 school year, we're not backfilling roles in schools from central office since we'll have a lot more time to plan for 21-22 than we did for 2021 with the enrollment loss. We've got lots of time to plan for it. So I don't see the need without, other people weighing in that would be the way they want to go.
Okay.
So Lisa, you can chime in if you'd like, but I think the big piece to really take into consideration and understand is this is the point in time where we're doing the full review of staffing positions across the district, right? So we're getting ready to move into workbook and allocation, and we have a similar review and process where we're taking a look at positions in central office specifically. So Lisa and I, along with other team members, are really doubling down and thinking about, with a specific focus on where we want to place priorities, reading specifically, how do the current positions we have really support that? And where do we need to make some adjustments? So that's happening right now. And Lisa, I'll pass it off to you if there's anything else that you want to add, but this is the timing. It typically is going to happen between now and the end of February. So we're sort of in it right now, having those discussions.
I wouldn't have much more to add from what Kelly and Deirdre had to say, except that we are looking at the positions that were frozen, where the vacancies exist, adjusting because of enrollment, and not changing any staffing levels that have been outlined in the past for specific categorical or compliance areas.
Okay, thanks. That makes sense. I keep going back, and this is the first time I've been through this entire budget cycle with all of you. But when I go back to thinking about when we review the plans, so when we review the special ed plan, when we review the ELL plan, when we review the advanced learner plan, a lot of the implementation questions seem to come back to staffing levels and if we have adequate staffing levels. And so just trying, I guess, to keep that in mind as we move forward. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. Does anyone else have questions or comments? Ananda?
I was really excited about the staffing doing list. I am curious on where are you getting information about what should stop?
Yeah, so all of our departments are working with kind of their teams. We also have principal advisory groups who certainly give us feedback as far as where the supports they have are high valued and where ideas they might have for maybe some stop doing items just because maybe they're not hitting the value at the school level that they might need. So it's both, a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm. Here's what I was thinking, Kelly, and just mostly because of my past experience with MMSD, is that often is the secretaries, the custodial folks, the SSAs, the CAs, the VAs, the VRSs, those are the ones that know so much around, like, how implementation or how like high level decisions end up impacting or not impacting at all their work. So I'm curious if there's a way to run for a few weeks somewhat of a campaign, and maybe we don't need to create any new platform. Maybe it's through the current Let's Talk platform that we established, that we will seek out, information or target information from different groups. That, and I don't know, I would have really, I think in a place like Madison, again, to the language around being an anti-racist, but acknowledging how racist our district is to understand that, like, how the hierarchy of racism and maleness and heterosexuals, all those isms play around the ability of people to speak their truth. And so I'm curious if we have, we have a platform that people can share things anonymously. And if we want, like, I think we also have a problem that is a collective problem around, COVID and recovering from COVID and this long journey ahead of us, plus low enrollment. I do think that we may want to use this really, serious opportunity to say, like, we really wanted to hear from our staff, and then encourage supervisors to do that as well. What should be in this, what are some of the things that people wanted to see different around how they perform their work? I think it would unearth some either communication things, internal communications, things that we think that everybody knows, but people don't know. And I think it might also unearth, like, how and where, like, racist practice is still really prevalent in our district.
Thank you, Ananda. Ali or Gloria, any comments?
I just want to echo the appreciation around full day 4K and the potential for expansion. And I want to thank Dr. Jenkins for really centering us on the possibilities and hope that we have for next year, and also grounding us in the reality of this current moment. And so I am so thrilled that we have you as our leader right now, guiding us through this process. And I think, this conversation, although I think deeply grounded in reality, I think it was so great to hear the exchange between Lisa and Savian around full day 4K as kind of this highlight that we're still moving forward and we're still, marching in the direction of our goals and our dreams for this community. So thank you all so much for emphasizing that this evening.
Thanks, Ali.
Thanks, Ali.
I will echo those thanks. Dr. Jenkins, I really appreciate your grounding us in a very solid strategy to move forward on this budget. Your words to introduce this section of the conversation I thought were powerful, and I really appreciate your drawing attention to things that we value, such as our staff and 4K and ensuring equity for all of our learners by starting in the early grades with literacy in 4K. Ananda, I really appreciated what you had to say about bringing in the voice of our staff, especially staff of color, and creating that stop-do list. And I'm wondering if the collaborative problem-solving process that we have with MTI could be part of that. I think that might be another really good way to bring staff voice to the table, particularly when we're looking at collaboratively solving problems around equity. I love that idea, so thank you for suggesting that. I also just would like to bring up that I personally think it's important for us to start base wage negotiations early this year, because we're going to be going back to school potentially in the spring, at least with some of our grades, or earlier. And we need to be able to have our staff focusing all of their energy on returning to school. And I'm thinking that if we are able to start base wage negotiations early this year and get those done, then we can just 100% focus on getting everybody back to school safely as we move into early spring or whenever it makes sense and it's safe to start returning. So those are my comments. Thanks again, Kelly, for laying this out so logically and making it easy to discuss all the different components of the budget. Dr. Jenkins.
Yeah, just one thing, and I really appreciate thank yous, but it's really been a team, all of us working together, chopping this up and saying, what are we going to prioritize based on your vision as a board? You have laid this out, and I appreciate the space that you're giving us, work together on this. I think it's a yes and what you had said about the collaborative problem solving. That's one piece, but I think Ananda's piece is at a different kind of piece and another level. And I really appreciate you making that comment, Ananda. And we're going to do the job, and we'll go back as a cabinet and talk about that. And I'm not trying to give a hierarchy to anything, but those individuals whose voices don't often wind up in the final decisions, I think we need to be very intentional about including them. And particularly, as you said, our staff of color, we need to make sure we get them at the table. Individuals who may represent positions that on a hierarchy, which I think when we're doing this, we're all adults, we have to drop the titles and whatever we can do to make it better for our children. So I want to thank you as a board. You guys don't often get a lot of thanks sometimes, but thank you because you're creating this space to give us the courage to be as bold as we're planning to be. So thank you.
All right, Kelly, let's move on.
All right, we'll wrap this up. The last slide in the presentation.
Oh, Chris, I'm sorry, just real quick, to something that Dr. Jenkins mentioned. One of the really intentional and important moments during my tenure was when Ali and I met with the security staff. We had MMSD staff in there. We asked them to just be there to support the space and take notes and listen. But we were able to create a very supportive space where we were able to listen to a lot of the things that the staff said. So I thank you, Dr. Jenkins, for saying that. And I think a lot, I'm just also following like how you are leading our district with a much greater level of transparency and wanting to really hear from folks. I think that speaks to the tool that is implemented. And so now we needed to elevate this tool and make sure that people know that this tool is for real.
All right.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you. Melissa, if you could pull the slides back up. There's just a kind of a final statement. We've kind of alluded to or mentioned additional funding coming from the federal level. It's kind of being dubbed ESSER 2, at least in the education circles. At this point, our estimate is really a $10 million kind of floor, could be anywhere between 10 and really $20 million. So we'll look to get more information out of DPI in the upcoming months. But the good news is it'll help us with funding needs that we'll need for 21-22 school year, such as COVID testing, PPE, supplies, needs that are directly related to COVID are items that would be eligible. All funds must be spent by September 22, meaning it's meant for the 21-22 school year, but it would be available for summer school this year and next year. So with some careful planning, kind of doubling down 2 summers in a row could be an opportunity for us. I've provided some areas for potential funding that are stated in the laws themselves, which would include food service. We do need to continue to watch our Fund 50 balances, which at this pace will probably finish in the red at the end of the year. So we'll have to continue to work and look at the food service line, along with mental health, summer semester programming. We'll have ongoing technology needs, particularly with any decisions or rollout of any online schooling that may happen 21-22. So those will be areas of focus for that additional money that our team will be working on. But like I said, the majority of that work will probably come to this board more in May and June. after we get some clearer guidance from the state and after we have a clearer picture of what 21-22 school year will probably look like based on the movement of COVID over the next few months too. So it'll be an area to remain flexible and agile in, but do know that we will have some relief coming from the federal government that will help us with our overall needs. And we couldn't be more thankful for that. So as it relates to next steps, which is the next slide, we'll be coming back to you in February around staffing strategies. And if our summer semester strategy is ready, we'll try to layer that into February or March if it's not quite ready for you yet. March will be healthcare and really a deep review on the excellence and equity project proposals in light of the community feedback and in light of the conversations that we had today about our focused priority areas. And then we'll aim to get that draft preliminary budget book done by the end of April for public consumption and deeper feedback. So those are our next steps. I look forward to kicking off this big process with you. This took a little while longer, but I thank you because it's just critical that we start these conversations this time of year. So with Chris, that's what I have for tonight. I don't know if anyone has any other questions.
Are there any final questions before we move into Title I? And you might need to speak up because I can't see people's hands. Kelly, I just had one quick question, which is in addition to ESSER 2, could you remind me how much money we had in ESSER 1 that we were going to be spending in 21-22?
Yeah, it was about $5 million.
Okay, so we're potentially looking at 10 to 20 million in ESSER 2 plus an additional 5 million from ESSER 1, which is great news. Like that could actually provide, the accelerated learning, the mental health supports, as well as PPE and health and safety investments that we desperately need to.
Yeah, a good portion of the ESSER 1 will likely be spent by the end of the year, and certainly by the end of the summer. So I don't think it'll be cumulative by the time we hit September 21. I think most of ESSER 1 will have been spent by that point. But certainly that'll be balancing as part of the April, May kind of work that we're doing together.
Probably not enough to actually deal with the pandemic, but still very good news. So yeah, thanks so much. All right, let's move on to Title I.
All right, I'm going to invite Jen Wallner and Lisa to join me up here. I'll put myself on mute and let Jen take us away.
Okay, hello everybody. Good evening. And actually, Lisa, I just jumped right in. I didn't know if you wanted to talk first or not, so I apologize for that.
Jennifer, take it away, my dear.
All righty. Okay. It's good to see everybody tonight. I am Jennifer Waldner. I work in state and federal programs, and one of the larger buckets of work that I oversee is Title I. So I wanted to start this evening just talking about a review and a grounding in what this is, how we allocate, how schools become eligible, and then current state, and then what we're thinking we're going to be seeing for 21-22. So there we go. Thanks, Melissa. Okay, so I always want to start with the definition of what Title I is, and it's a federally funded program designed to close achievement gaps and ensure that all children have a fair, equal, and significant opportunity to obtain a high quality education. So Title I, there's a lot of compliance that comes along with this. We'll talk a little bit about some of it this evening. But the program components, the main program components are a needs assessment and program plan design for use of funds, family engagement, we'll talk about that in a bit, appropriately licensed teachers, equitable participation by private school students. Not many people out there understand that this is a public school's responsibility. So we have 30 private schools. I will talk about that in the next slide. And then coordination with early child care providers. So next slide. Okay, so I borrowed this slide from DPI. It's one that I think explains a lot, and it helps me always kind of reframe where the money is coming from. So funds are coming from the U.S. Department of Education, and they're distributed across the state. So each state receives money based on census data. So right away, if there's large swings in poverty across the nation, that could really impact what Madison receives each year through our title allocation. So again, census data is then used by each state to distribute funds to the districts. So once we receive the funds in Madison, we have to take a pause because this is where the private parochial equitable share comes in. So we need to make sure that if there were children that were part of the census count that brought the allocation to Madison, who then choose to enroll in a private school, then the funds need to follow them in the form of services. And this is all defined through law. So we work very closely with our 30 private schools within the Madison attendance area. But then we also have private schools across across district boundaries where some students do attend. And again, funds need to follow them wherever they go. So while we are working on that equitable share, figuring out where our private schools students are, if they reside in a Title I attendance area, there's a kind of a lot of underground work that's going on there. We are also working at the same time to figure out which of our schools are going to be receiving a Title I allocation. So if you can go to the next slide, Melissa. So I like to say that Madison works a little backwards when it comes to allocating out our Title I award, but backwards in a good way, because most districts get their award and then they take money off the top for district level Title I initiatives, and then what's ever left over goes out to the schools. But what we do in Madison is we take the absolute most that we can, and we direct that out to the schools first. And this is done during budget and staffing. We are right at that start of that cycle right now. So when the workbooks go out to the principals, Title I funds go out at the same time. And then our award comes in June, and we are assuming that we are we would hope our award comes in higher than expected. If it does, we can add to that allocation that goes out to the principals, but quite honestly, things have been pretty lean and we haven't been able to do that in a couple years. So this year for 2021, we had $5 million that we were able to direct out to the schools. And then we took our reservations. So we have to take a family engagement reservation because 1% of the top is required if a district receives more than $500,000 in an overall award. And we received about a $5.8 million award. So our 1%, we actually took a little more, which is about $100,000, and that's directed straight back to the Title I schools. So each Title I school receives a Title I budget, and then or a Title I budget and a Title I family engagement budget. And then we have some other reservations that we take. Melissa, if you could go to the next slide. Okay, so I just pulled this straight from the budget book details that outlined like what happened with Title I this year for 2021. So this is showing that we have a $5.8 million grant award. $5 million went directly out to the schools. And then we have about $1.3 million in reservations. And I know the math doesn't quite work out, but we do operate on carryover each year. So we do have unspent budgets from last year that carried over into this year. What I want to point out here, though, is the reservation detail at the bottom of the slide. The question is raised many times throughout the year. What's the percentage that we're taking in reservation versus what's going out in the schools? And that's a very valid, very good question to continually raise because that's something that we always want to make sure that the funding is going where it needs to go, which is to our kids, out to the schools. But it's difficult to answer reservation percentages because there are reservations we take that actually go straight out to the schools too. So administrative cost, we do take a reservation there to run the Title I program. That private school equitable share that I spoke about, that is a required reservation. Family engagement, we spoke about that. But we also now, we take a homeless reservation and we have historically for years, but now it's actually required of us to take a homeless reservation. When a child is experiencing homelessness, they're automatically labeled as Title I. So we want to make sure that we are prepared to serve all of our students regardless of whether they are in a Title building or not. So we are funding our TEP program through Title I. And then we have centralized services. We have about 1.9 FTE right now because there was a vacancy in CNI staff that provide direct services out to Title I schools. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next slide and talk about, so now I'm going to kind of shift into Title I school eligibility. We have our money and we know how much is going to go out to the schools, but who are the schools that are going to be receiving funding? So Title I eligibility is based on the number of children ages 5 to 17 in poverty in a school's attendance area on second Friday in January. I know we have some second Friday counts already in, but we don't have the exact final numbers that I need for these title calculations. So we are not ready yet with knowing exactly who our 2021 title schools are this year. But I do want to speak to this poverty count. We said that we use census data to bring the allocation to the school district, but then when the data that we use to determine who is in poverty is actually a direct certification count. And I know some of you have been with us for a while where you can recall that years ago, and this is quite a few years ago now, when we were bringing on the CEP schools, so the community eligibility provision schools, the schools where children ate free, we lost track of our free and reduced income information, which is what we used to use for this data set to determine which schools were title eligible. And losing the data set was actually what was intended. I mean, this was designed to reduce paperwork load on parents and so that their children can eat free in the schools. But there wasn't an understanding that there were still poverty-driven programs in the district that needed this data. So DPI stepped in and quickly assisted us and guided us to use this direct certification data. So this is a label coming to us directly from the Department of Workforce and Development, and it categorizes a child if their family is participating in a variety of welfare programs. So we technically aren't using free and reduced counts when we're determining our title eligibility. We're now looking at our free counts. And then schools are Title I eligible if they meet or exceed the district poverty average. So I'm going to show you what that means on this next slide. Okay, so these are I know it's a little small, so I apologize for that, but these are my exact calculations from this time last year when we were calculating who was going to be Title I for 2021. So what happens is I take a rank order, a list by direct certification. I'm rank ordering by poverty, elementary schools, middle schools, and then towards the bottom of the slide, you'll see high schools. We come up with a district poverty average, and then if a school meets or exceeds the district poverty average, they are Title I eligible. So historically, we have always served our schools that have come up as Title I eligible. And that includes for 2021, these 19 elementary, 10 middles, and then Capital High we serve. We serve in rank order of poverty, like I said, and then we also follow a tiered model which directs funding to higher poverty schools. So if you look closely at this, you will see that Marquette is poverty is at 36%, but then Lindbergh has a poverty of 65%. So when we are talking about equitable based education, it doesn't make sense to and I know there are other factors that we can measure when we are looking at student need, but here it's always a question if we direct the same amount of funds to a lower poverty school versus our upper tiered schools. So we don't. We really make sure that our higher poverty schools are receiving more title funding. We do stop serving at Capital High, and that's really because the money's run out. We have to be able to show DPI that we are serving a school with enough funds for what they consider an effective Title I program. And if we can't do that, we're not allowed to serve. So that's why we kind of put the stop there at capital high. The last thing I wanted to point out with this slide is I keep referring to rank order of poverty. We cannot serve Falk and then skip Shank, Glendale, Muir, and then serve Gompers and then skip a couple more schools. We have to literally serve each school in that poverty order. We can stop at any time, but we can't skip schools. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide. So this slide is just showing that once we figure out who our Title I schools are, we then are working to come up with that Title I school budget that's released to the schools during workbook time. And really, it's a very simple formula of direct certification counts or number of direct certification students multiplied by a per pupil amount. And that per pupil amount is what is changing when we're crossing those tiers, that 4-tiered approach when we're serving our schools. It's important to keep in mind here that the funding to each title school can fluctuate wildly each year, even in a non-COVID, non-pandemic year. So we can have changes in the overall grant award, like we mentioned earlier. If poverty changes across the nation or the state, that impacts what Madison's receiving. We've had 2X charter enrollment. State level contributions actually play a part in how much money we receive at the federal level. Changes in the school enrollment, which we are definitely seeing this year. Changes in that rank order, like where the school falls in that rank order, what tier they're falling in, depends on what type of monetary support they'll be receiving. And then also increases or decreases in the number of Title I eligible schools. If more schools come on that list or some fall off, that really impacts that overall pool of funds, that $5 million that went out to the schools this year as to like who receives what. The last thing that I did not put on here though that I was thinking about is we have the principal's budget off of average salaries during workbook for Title I. So they receive the funds and then they have an average salary that they can work with to assign FTE. So depending on our salary or insurance changes throughout the year, that does impact too how much or how far a title budget can go for a school. So the Title I school level budget projections for 2021, like I said, I don't really have those calculated out yet. We do have some projections though based on January 4th, so I'm assuming it's going to be pretty close. First, all entitlement grants are predicted to be flat funded. So we're hearing this from DPI. This means that we should expect the same amount of funds being released by the feds and going out to each state. Again, how poverty plays into that, that's something that we need to wait and see. Award is usually released around June. We have lost over $400,000 from last year to this year with our overall Title I grant award. And things are getting really tight. Our carryover is smaller. Our average salaries aren't going as far, and we are bringing on, we have the most Title I schools on our list than we've ever had in the past. So we are needing to, for 21-22, bring that back down to 4.85 million going out to the schools. That's a pretty historical figure that we have been comfortable with for quite a few years, but again, we had some increases which allowed us to go up to that 5 million. We definitely can't do that this year. So we are predicting changes in that Title I eligible school list due to just overall changes, enrollment changes from the fall due to COVID. So we are seeing projection-wise 2 schools coming off the list and 1 school coming on. Again, we will confirm that hopefully by the end of this week. And as far as schools coming off the list, this is kind of that last bullet there that I want to talk about. We have the ability to offer a 1-year extension to any title school that does not meet or exceed that eligibility or that average, that poverty average when we put them in that rank order. So we removed that. Well, let me back up. Years ago, if a school became Title I, they knew they were Title I for 2 years because we always offered that 1-year extension. We had to pull that back last year because we started bringing on, we brought on so many Title I schools that we didn't have the funds to continue serving all of those schools if even more came on. So we shared with the principals that if this happens, if you fall off this list, we can't offer that 1-year extension. But now with COVID, with the potential changes, with the changes that we know are happening in enrollment, we need to revisit this in order to keep our schools as stable as possible. I did say I'm seeing 2 schools fall off that list, but we are definitely having conversations to put that 1-year exception back in place, just to make sure that we're keeping our schools stable through this next year. Interestingly, January now drives what happens next year. So that's, I know next fall is a long ways away, but unfortunately that's how these counts work. Okay, and I believe that is what I have for Title I. So Lisa, I didn't know if you had anything to add to that before we moved into the discussion.
No, Jennifer, I think that you covered all of the highlights. I know this is a really very busy time for you as you're looking for final numbers and getting information out to schools. I think it is important for the board to know Title I is a dollarized budgeting process. And we do use average salaries. So that is a different process than the workbook, which deals in FTE. But no, Jennifer, I appreciate your presentation. And as I say all the time, Jennifer, you do this job a lot better than I did 8 years ago. And I'm so glad that you're with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that informative presentation. I saw Savian, then Nikki, then Ollie.
Thank you so much for that thorough presentation. I guess I have a series of like 3 interlocking questions. One, did we see any schools that are newly Title I schools? For our Title I schools, did the decline in enrollment, was that proportionate with the district-wide average, or the average for whatever type of school they're in, whether it be elementary, middle, or high school? And related to that, did we see a percentage of students qualifying for free and reduced lunch within those schools? So like, did their enrollment decrease, but their needs increase?
Okay, so I will try to answer all 3 of those questions. New Title I schools, I saw changes just with regards to the elementary schools. So I am seeing that Kennedy is projecting to be a Title I school. Again, I can't confirm anything because I just don't have these final numbers. This was based off of our numbers at the very beginning of January. So I'm sorry, can you ask the next part of your question?
Yeah, for schools that qualify as Title I, was their drop in enrollment on par with the district-wide average? And then did the percentage of like students who qualify for free and reduced lunch increase?
You know, because I work so closely in the private parochial world, I can't say that there was an overall drop in percentage across the district. We're seeing pockets across the district, certain areas where we know children then went and enrolled in the private schools. So that's going to impact specific schools whose, so their percentages were off. So enrollment actually, Savion, may have stayed the same, but that low income percentage decreased. So it was nothing in general. It was so school specific what happened with title.
Yeah, Saban, I would say that the trend district wide is that it's really school specific. We had very different COVID effects at different communities on enrollment, up and down, and low income leavers and high income leavers at very different schools. And there's a slide from that November presentation that's in there by school that's kind of worth looking at that. But I didn't see because of Title I. There was just a lot of movement at individual schools.
Right. So going back, I could private schools and then the 2X charter enrollment, I did see impact our Title I school enrollments.
Got it. And then a final question for Kelly or Deidre. Do we have comparables for the average teacher salary serving in a Title I school versus non-Title I school?
I don't think I have that. Definitely not at my fingertips.
Yeah, I would agree, Kelly. I think we can, Savion, we can probably get that, but it'll just take us a little bit of time to put it together, but we certainly can work on providing that information.
Thank you.
A number of years ago, we changed the rules on Title I funding in our district, not on the funding part, but to allow funding for a third assistant principal. Are we still comfortable with that assumption, or can we revisit that at some time? Because I know some principals have chosen to use that to fund a third assistant principal, and I'm wondering if that money could be better spent on providing an extra BA, SEA, librarian, etc.
Yeah, Nikki, I don't think we have 3 APs. Leopold had purchased a second AP out of Title. Jen, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think we have 3 APs anywhere.
Right. Leopold purchased a second. Yeah. And the assistant principal position is an allowable position on Title I. So that is something that's coming from the state.
Okay, so that's not our rule. That's the state allows that.
The state does allow that.
I would also add that there is a strategic staffing and budget approval process that happens every year with the chiefs of schools. And as they design strategic staffing plans for schools based on data and student need, that plan, including the use of Title I funding, is examined and approved through that final presentation process. So there are checks and balances in there to make sure that the use of federal funds aligns with student need and the the school improvement plan.
Great, thank you. That was helpful.
Ollie?
Thanks, Chris. Jennifer, I really appreciate the presentation. I think, drawing our attention to the structure of the funding and the reality of where we're at, but also just if I could take us back to the slide where it breaks down where every school is at. We're a high poverty district, even our schools that are not Title I schools. You're talking about about 20% of students live in poverty, right? So 1 in 5 kiddos who attend even our schools who have the smallest percentage of kids living in poverty. I think it's also hard not to notice, especially at the elementary school level, where there are more concentrations of poverty, and really looking at what that means for kind of our attendance areas and strain on specific schools and communities related to poverty, and how we can be sensitive to that as a district. I do really appreciate highlighting the needs of our students who experience homelessness and housing insecurity. The average age of a homeless person in Dane County is 9 years old. We serve over 1,000 students who are homeless. And as our community continues to be impacted by COVID, as we see unemployment rates skyrocket, we're seeing more people apply for benefits and need support than ever before in history. And so I think that having a real sense of how to create stability and equity as we distribute Title I funding is relevant, as well as the guidelines around how we do that. Are there innovations around Title I that are specific to where we currently are positioned that you want to highlight or emphasize for us as a board?
That's a tricky question, because there are things that we know we want to do, but we have to align with law. So that's always going to be something that has to be in the backs of our minds as far as how we allocate, looking at that rank order of poverty. So Lisa, I don't know if you have any other.
I
input to that.
actually appreciate that question, Ali, and I think that in many spaces and places we're pushed to answer that question. Are we, what are we getting for our dollars at these Title I schools, and what are the best practices that we're seeing? I think if we really are an anti-racist district, we need to dig into that and be more intentional about looking at the data to be sure that those dollars are being put to their best and highest use, which is our focus on early literacy, our focus on social and emotional and mental health as we come out of these pandemics, and we are still in the pandemics. So I do appreciate that question, and I want you to keep asking it because we need to keep digging into that.
Are there any other questions, Chris?
Yeah, I'm just curious where the reporting for Title I flows back. Does that go through our ESSA plan? Does that go through the schools? My understanding, the schools have flexibility in how they use their Title I funds depending on their goals. And I really appreciate that part of that because it's really setting the goals at the school level. And the schools get to decide where the needs are. How do we measure that, or how do we look at that, or how does that come back to the board to show how that is working year by year, especially to look at those fluctuations that you talk about and see where those occur?
So compliance wise, I can speak to that piece, and then maybe Lisa can jump in with that question as well. Principals are allowed to spend and align with their needs, but they need to be able to demonstrate through a needs assessment that that is a need at their school. So we are always going back to the school improvement plan. So is it a need that's defined through their SIP? That's going to determine whether an expenditure is allowable or not. Anything that a principal spends on, there needs to be an agreement with me. So we have budgets that principals are working on. So they can't make any expenditures without a prior approval. That's just an automatic audit trail. That is something that DPI is looking at as well. We have a WISE grants application. Every expenditure that is made on Title I needs to be entered into this grant application with DPI. There needs to be an approval, and then we can make claims to get our funds back. So these are not funds, and I think that's maybe not something I hit on. These are not funds that we receive. We are making claims. We are spending, and then we're making claims, and we're getting these funds back from DPI. So there's a very tight communication process between the principals, between myself, and between HR and budget and accounting to make sure we are all on the same page when it comes to these grant expenditures.
I would also just add, thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate that the expenditures and the way that the funds are targeted this year in a different way towards early literacy and acceleration, that's something that is discussed in the final presentation as well. And Chris, if there's anything that aligns with any federal, improvement efforts that are happening from the federal level down to the state, that's something that we would get through our district assessment coordinator, Tim Peterson or Caroline. And if and when that comes down, that's something that we would make available to the board for further discussion.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Other questions or comments on titles? Savian?
Yeah, I just want to elevate the point that Ali made, particularly around students experiencing homelessness. Do we have alignment between Title I schools and community schools? Like, is there a priority that as we continue to expand the community schools program that, they serve the schools with the most need, that need the most wraparound services?
We definitely do. We are making sure that principals are aware of, first of all, aligning their budgets to meet the most need at their school when it comes to the community schools and Title I. So we are definitely keeping an eye on that. I am also the homeless liaison for the school district, which is very helpful when it comes to making sure that our students experiencing homelessness are having their needs met, with them being automatically Title I. That is something that we need to make sure is happening at all of our schools across the district, not just our community schools or just our Title I schools. So yes, we definitely have an eye supports for our students.
I say, and the only thing I want to add is when we selected the community schools, we used a list of metrics, and the same data set that would select a Title I school was one of the main data sets of the community school. So kind of by nature of the two kind of formulas for selection, they're more than likely going to be title schools that are community schools.
Yeah. I was going to ask Jennifer to speak to it for everyone's benefit. The needs assessment, it's a comprehensive needs assessment. And just if you could describe who all participate in that, Jennifer, and then I
Sure.
can give a better context.
Sure. So there's two levels of the needs assessment that, and I'm going to speak to what DPI is looking for us to meet compliance with Title I. So the district, we are constantly reviewing our data, reviewing what our needs are at the district level before we even look at the Title I schools. That's something DPI comes in and they audit us every 3 years on our Title I initiatives. And what that first question is, lay out your needs assessment. What does this look like? And our needs assessment is our strategic framework work. There is no, there isn't another, I think that was something that we all had to come to an agreement on years ago, that there is no other work. There is no other big plan. It's our framework. That's what everything goes back to. When we then dig a little deeper and we talk about school level needs assessment, again, we're talking about our school improvement plan. That's something that each school, we know about that. I'm not going to present on that all too much. But interestingly, Dr. Jenkins, the school improvement plan, the needs assessment plan at the school level, the big piece that DPI is looking for is there parent input? And is this shared with our families? I mean, that is the key to everything really when it's coming to needs assessment questions. And I'm not sure that we do the best job that we could in that area right now. I'll just put that out there.
That goes back, if I may, to Ananda's question about getting the voices. There are structures in place, but are we actually executing them at the highest level? And I've been in a lot of places and have also been a part of audits. The parent engagement piece with the title dollars, and you're supposed to, sometimes lack. So as a team, we're going to be intentional about ensuring our schools are getting the voices of the parents. And that's, when you mention community schools, that's definitely what should be happening too. Parents' voices should be a part of it. So that's why I wanted you to say that, Jennifer. Thank you.
I just want to chime in quick with a question, Chris, and I see your hand. I'm wondering, just to follow up on that, Dr. Jenkins, have we considered asking our Title I schools to include a parent on their school-based leadership teams to help ensure that voice in needs assessment at the school level?
Go ahead. Someone was agreeing.
Schools have to demonstrate to me through compliance that they are providing voice, that there is voice from their parents when it comes to needs assessment and their school improvement planning. So I do see that that's happening. To what level, I'm not the one to comment on that. I know some schools are doing an amazing job, and I think other schools need a little more support.
And that's the key for us in central office, making sure we're giving support to the schools. And this goes back to our collaborative problem solving that we're going to be doing throughout. We will speak to that as well. But that's a trigger that we do know works when the parents' voices are involved. You can too see some increases in your schools.
Yes, I saw your hand. So, and then Ananda.
Yeah, it was just a last question. As you were talking about the needs assessment and referring that it's really our strategic framework work, is it the same thing as our ESSA plan? Because I know our ESSA plan has components of Title I in it, and it's required for any school that receives a certain amount of title funding. Is it?
Right, Chris, sorry for interrupting you. It's required for any district that received Title I funding. So we have an ESSA plan. We're working on updating the ESSA plan. There has been so many changes this year. It feels like we get to a version and we need to revisit that again. The ESSA plan is something that's required if a district's going to receive entitlement funding. So funding across all the titles. So it's not just in reference to Title I. We're talking about Title I, 2, 3, 1D, our homelessness work. So anything that's coming from that ESSA law is being referenced in that plan. And what the plan is, it's something that we complete through our WISE grants, through our DPI WISE grants application, and it's narratives that we're completing when we're going through and building each grant under each title. So yes, you're right though, when you said, is it our strategic framework? It absolutely is. It absolutely is.
It just brings me back to thinking about how this all fits together. And if we can have a conversation at some point about our ESSA plan, I think that would really help us bring a lot of these title initiatives that we're taking in different schools and just getting the bigger picture. So thank you for this presentation and appreciate it.
Thank you.
Ananda?
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. It's great to see you, Jen. I appreciate the way you framed the conversations to us. I think it was really illuminating. I have a couple of comments that came up for me, a couple of things that came up for me. One is, sort of the purpose of Title I. Like the goal of Title I was really to bring some sense of equalization of educational outcomes. So my first question is, has Title I in Madison worked?
That's a really big question. Lisa, I'm probably going to need your help with this, but first I'm going to say, back in the day when Madison would allocate the straight amount, same amount to every school that qualified as Title I don't think that was working. And we shifted to equitably reviewing our schools and looking at our schools with the most need and targeting our funds to those schools. So I can say we're getting better. I'm not sure if we're all the way there yet.
Ananda, I would also offer that question similar to what Ali questioned a bit earlier. I would encourage us as a district that is anti-racist to really think about, as we move into next year, is the way we allocate anti-racist. From our schools that are highest poverty to our schools that are actually much lower in poverty than some of our top schools. Is that actually an anti-racist way to allocate? And then what measures are we using? We've all been talking about, we need to do better. Our reading scores are not where we need them to be. We need to do better in all of our schools. A few years ago, if some of you will remember, we actually had a targeted strategy through Title I. For our highest poverty schools, we targeted a strategy around literacy and foundational skills and actually saw growth in those highest need schools above that of those in really those second tier schools. What happened? We expanded that strategy to more schools. We lost the targeted focus. And we tend to do that, right? Without keeping that really intentional focus on schools and students that need us the most. So I think it calls on us to really think about what strategies are targeted. What do we mean when we say rigorous instruction and anti-racist teaching and learning? I think we have to take a new and fresh look at that. And as schools work with their SIP plans and identify their student focus groups and their data, what are they doing to reflect on that at the end? And how can we make that more public and transparent? So more work to be done on that. I look forward to working actually with Andrew and his team to determine what exactly the metrics are that give us the best information about how those Title I schools are faring or not.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Jen. It wasn't meant to be a trick question. I'm really seriously thinking about all of this. Uh, the mechanics of the allocation of funding and how it shows up at the school, right? Like, I think that conversation is not something like parent are like, I can tell like so many parents, they don't know like this, what you just presented to us. Like, even if they go to a school that is a Title I school, like my daughter attended Title I schools, and I learned that there was an allocation for family engagement, like when she was in middle school. And so I think that there is a disconnect in how the classification of Title I and then making that very explicit, right? There is an investment in the school that is extremely explicit. How is that showing up? And I appreciate Lisa bringing up the targeted strategy. How is it showing up in a very targeted way? I think something that you both said made me think too, it's a really good segue to my next question around, as you know, I'm very familiar with the compliance requirements for the Department of Public Instruction. And I think I can say this really freely. The compliance is a baseline all across the state for schools with varying degrees. I have really high expectations for Madison. And what we know about Madison plans, what I know about Madison plans is that we do a fantastic job in our plans. We speak really well about things. We articulate things really well. We have really good metrics. Our struggle is somewhere else. So I'm really curious on how are you seeing, in particular, SIP goals of our schools, Title I schools, and I'm even more curious at like our top 10 elementary schools there. How have you changed like the way, I know SIP is also something that has evolved significantly over the last few years. How are you seeing that evolution, and what is the horizon for you?
Thank you, Ananda. I am going to turn that over to our chiefs as they've been developing the SIP 2.0 process with schools.
Oh, cool. Thanks.
Thank you for that question. Part of what we've been doing with SIP is to be more intentional around prioritizing specifically around the students that we will focus on. And so their schools use their data to select the focus group of students and then match the specific strategies that will be used in order to make improvements around academics and social emotional goals. Mike, did you want to add anything else?
No, I think that you have that. I also know just part of the other SIP strategies for the high schools is that we're using the 9OT data as well. And that doesn't necessarily align to the question that you just asked, Ananda. However, we do use the ACT with reading, the reading and math as well.
Dr. Clary, were you going to add something, or?
Nope, just letting you know I was here if you needed me.
I wasn't sure. You came all illuminated. I was like, okay, he's ascending somewhere. So thank you. And I know I see Dr. Pryor. Anyway, so thank you for that. I think there's a part of me that really is looking for what is beyond compliance that that we can really lean in? What is next, in particular around the challenge that we have? We're going to continue to be around virtual, hybrid, and the impact of COVID in our children. The other thing that we're doing in the department that's been really interesting, and definitely we don't have it figured out, is the collaboration between Title I and special ed, both from a compliance strategy, but also like so much of the intersection and the way in which investment can really highlight our commitment, in particular our commitment to the goals that we laid out. And so how those things get connected and elevated. So I'm not looking for any particular answer, but would love to hear from anyone around anything.
Well, I can say that I have been part of those conversations with DPI, and I am in student services. I work very closely with John Harper. We know that IDEA and ESSA cannot cross paths. I mean, that's just not something we can do. But you're correct, our children do cross paths. We do have Title I students who are also identified. So we need to make sure that we're keeping an eye on both of them with our resource alignment. That's really important. I am really appreciative that DPI is finally taking a look at that intersection between ESSA and IDEA. So hopefully more to come and more good direction from the state as well.
It's interesting that you asked that question, and I think this morning I'd sent Jennifer an email. I had a question about Title I schools, and I wanted to look at what schools were using their Title I's for through staff, because I was looking at a correlation between whether if they're using it for a family engagement coordinator, if they were using it for a reading or a math interventionist. I know that a school I've been talking with is looking at a math interventionist but didn't have it. So I wanted to see if there was any trend data within the district, as well as some of the schools using them for student and or family engagement, just to see if there is a tie-in with attendance, engagement as in both in class, not in the hallways, and or behavior. I think somebody mentioned earlier, I think Nikki mentioned a BEA. I wasn't able to find anything like that, but it's just something that in my mind, as I'm entering back into the middle school and we're going into the allocation season, I wanted to make sure I had that information as we were problem solving or being thought partners together to see what's the biggest bang for the buck with Title I. So I don't have that answer yet, but we're hoping to have that.
I really appreciate the investigative approach to that. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Chris.
All right. So before we move on to our next agenda item, Jennifer, I wonder if you just had any concluding words about how the feedback you've gotten tonight might be reflected as we move through the budget process into June. Are there things we should be looking for or watching for, or next steps?
So my next steps are, again, to get those calculations finalized. And then I start projecting scenarios of what that tiered approach can look like. So this conversation, I think, is going to be very helpful in guiding our chiefs, who are going to be the ones that are going to do that final review of the allocations that go to the schools, along with Lisa as well. Just to make sure that we're on the right track. I mean, I think this conversation was very confirming that we do need to be looking at our allocation process a bit differently, and there are things that we can change. I will be honest, I'm not confident that this is the year to make great change. I mean, I think this is the year that we need to hold our schools as stable as possible when it comes to budget and allocation. But that doesn't mean that the discussions can't happen and we can't start preparing for just using that equitable lens and that anti-racism, looking for that anti-racism work. I mean, that's something that I'm going to take with me from this conversation.
Chris, and then title always comes back to the board through the budgeting process as a check-in in April before we finalize our draft budget book. And then it always comes back in October, certainly when we get our final numbers and final adjustments. So title will remain through the course of the budgeting conversations.
Thank you so much. And that concludes the budget portion of tonight's program. I know that we've been sitting here for a while, but I am hopeful that the next two discussion items on the agenda will not be lengthy, and I'd actually opt to just push ahead. The next item on the agenda is the proposed attachment-detachment agreement with the DeForest Area Public Schools. And I think Kelly and Sherry, are you guys going to be talking about that?
Yeah, let Sherry join us up here. Sherry, you want to start us off?
Sure, I can. So typically, at least since I've been with the district, we've had at least one attachment or detachment each year to look at adding areas to Madison's attendance areas. This year, we are bringing this to you in the work group primarily because this is a new one. And it is not subject to an outside agreement with the DeForest School District, whereas the prior ones that you have observed or been advised on are subject to an agreement that we have with the Middleton Cross Plains School District. Essentially, Kelly was contacted by a number of alders about the possibility of essentially doing a land swap to more strategically align school districts. And I'll let her give you a little overview of what it'll be. But essentially what we're doing is we're going to switch properties such that it will enhance our school district and also provide better transportation pattern for both school districts so that, no student will be adversely impacted. And that is one of the goals of attachments and detachments is to, ensure that none of our families are adversely impacted when we decide to either add property to our district or detach property from our district. So with that, I'll just let Kelly go ahead and give you the overview. If you have questions, I'm here to answer any of those questions.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry. Yes, Sherry's right. It's very kind of rare in this world that we get a win-win when it comes to a land swap with another school district, but this is certainly one of those cases and is in full alignment with the direction of the board in an attempt to align boundaries. So the analysis is all attached here. What you're seeing in the analysis attached is that the two green rectangles that are in the map are just north of Lakeview. They are currently undeveloped farmland. That would be the property by which we are proposing we attach. So it's currently part of DeForest. It's about to be kind of built up from the farmland and turn into a number of houses and apartment complexes on that property in the future. The city has yet to go through its approval process, waiting for us to take our first step, and then the city will move through the rest of their processes for the future of development of that property. And in return, we would trade back to DeForest what is the red triangle space on that map. It is over in the Sandburg Elementary area. So overall, the reason why we are kind of calling this a win-win is in the two green boxes, which are yet to be developed. We really gain quite a bit of acreage in this particular trade, and it is yet to be developed. So it's yet to really get to the land value and improvement value over time, which would increase our tax base over time. Whereas if DeForest were to maintain those particular properties in the green rectangle space, all of those students would need to be bused to the DeForest Elementary School, which is on the other side of the airport, and looking at a 45-minute plus bus ride for those low-income families. Whereas if they're in our school district, they could walk to Gompers Elementary, which is our proposal of where these particular plots of land route to, which I'll come back to in a minute. The red triangle space just north of Sandburg is part of City of Madison and part of Town of Burke, but the really almost the entire neighborhood surrounding that triangle is already deforested. And you can see that in the maps. One of the maps has a little white dots. Those little white dots are students that are enrolled in MMSD. So where there's not white dots, then they are going to deforest. And that particular property is a lot closer to their elementary school and would produce fewer students. So between the two properties, there's also a lot more students that is going to come out of those green boxes. Reason number two, why this is a win-win for us. We can use students in that particular attendance area routing into Gompers. You'll see that in the analysis as well. There is room in Gompers for the number of students that this property would develop into, whereas Lakeview would not be able to hold all the students that are being developed out of that land, and Gompers would. Both are walkable schools for this particular area. On the other side of town, the property of which we would trade away when it's fully developed would route into Sandburg, and Sandburg's enrollment and capacity are not at maximum, but they're certainly at the higher end. And that entire triangle routing into Sandburg would put it at or over capacity. So it's a really nice trade for us because we're bringing students in to an area of town of which we need it. We're gaining acreage and we'll gain tax and land value as it's developed. And it's a nice deal for DeForest. It's right in their neighborhood in an area where they are in need of schools and or students, and is closer to their elementary school. So in the short run, a little bit of loss of taxes, or tax base to this school district. But as a reminder, we have a $31 billion tax base. So the numbers in this trade are very, very immaterial to our overall tax base. So, but the idea of adding more students in the areas of town of which we need them, in particular for lower income families that are likely to live in this neighborhood, and giving them a walking school seems like the right equity strategy for us as well. So I think I've covered the main key points probably as fast as I could considering the time tonight. So let me know if you have any questions, but we're certainly excited.
So before we launch into questions, I would really like to encourage you to focus your questions on any additional information you need to be able to vote on this next Monday when we are scheduled to vote. So please, clarification questions or additional information you might need before we take that vote. Ananda?
You may have said this before, Kelly. And I know neither of those places are currently developed. Are there residents currently on? Are there students currently in neither of those properties?
There are no students on either one of the properties today. There's a handful of farmhouses, some of which might have a few older adults, but no families or school-based children. And you can see that evidence by no dots in there from MMSD standpoint, and DeForest has done the same kind of look on their end, and there's no students.
Okay, thank you for that. And then the segue is that are there any concerns or comments from community members?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I missed that in my talking point, so I'm glad you asked.
No, it's okay.
We met with both alders, and we also met with the Northside Planning Council to make sure that we were in alignment with their overall vision before we move forward. And they are in complete agreement that this is the right move for the Northside.
Thank you so much.
Anyone else have questions? Kelly, I just wanted to know, since there are no students living in these areas, and we do have to provide demographic information as part of the our requirements for doing the attachment and detachment, did we just develop that demographic information by looking at the surrounding neighborhoods?
Yes. So that's the information is attached.
And where are our estimates of student numbers coming from?
The property analysis, which is built into the PDF that's attached, and that's coming from the city and their best estimates based on what they know to date. But like I said, a lot of those plans haven't been approved, so it's based on the best planning information that the city planning department has. I actually should use this as an opportunity to thank the city and their planning department. This is actually probably the best example of city and school district partnership where we both have like information that can come to the table between Rebecca Kemble and the city planning department themselves. This is a really great example of partnership and teamwork.
All right. Any other comments or questions before we move on? Thank you so much, Kelly and Sherry, for bringing this forward. And if people have any questions that come up, please reach out to Kelly or Dr. McGregory during the week and let them know so that we'll be ready to vote on Monday.
Thank you.
All right, our final agenda item tonight is an update on the handbook process. And I believe Deirdre is going to provide that.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I have Heidi Tepp here as well, if there are any questions. And before we jump in, I just want to express my sincere gratitude to the board and appreciation for this evening, the conversation. It really is inspiring and affirming and hopeful to listen to the dialogue and have such specific, intentional emphasis on anti-racism and equity in education. So I just wanted to be able to express that appreciation. We're here to just share a really brief update. I want to share some key points with the board, and then I'll turn it over for questions. So as a reminder, the district brought a recommendation to revise the handbook language specific to surplus and layoff to the board last July. The reasons for that recommendation for the language changes was really premised on establishing meaningful criteria for making these decisions where seniority is not the sole decision point. This obviously is more important now than ever, and it's highlighted by the recent increase in our teachers of color being hired within the district in the last few years. In addition to the understanding that seniority is not an indicator of qualifications or performance, and particularly in service of good outcomes for our students. As we noted over time, the current language has come to serve as a structure of racial inequity that runs counter to our commitment to dismantle these very structures, policies, and procedures that interfere with our progress on fighting inequities and racism within our educational system. At the workshop in July, the board directed us specifically to go back and have the handbook committee really continue meeting on three very specific things. And that was creating a rubric specific to the surplus and layoff, design an appeal process for layoff, and remove the 30-day layoff notice as it was written at that time. So since July, we've been working collaboratively with the union on this issue, working to keep the focus of the board's directives within the discussion. It's important to note that both MMSD and our union partners acknowledge that surplus and layoff, that particular piece of work is certainly a small piece of a larger collaborative effort that we want to continue to engage in specific to recruitment, selection, and retention of staff of color. And this has really become apparent for us as we've progressed through this work in the last several months. We're definitely committed to taking a more global view of this work and examining current recruitment and engagement efforts and working on retention. Our overarching goal in this process is to improve staff composition, staff stability, improve satisfaction, and maximize retention of our staff of color, while still prioritizing surplus and layoff language as our first deliverable in this broader, more comprehensive work. It's also imperative that we obtain input from a broader, more diverse group of teachers, and we want to be able to prioritize that. We know that a long-term comprehensive plan is going to result in better outcomes. And with that said, it's also important for us to acknowledge that in the area of surplus and layoff, we may not come to full agreement. We are committed to continuing the conversations, particularly prioritizing diverse teacher voice when we finalize the surplus and layoff language, and we want to bring that back in March. So in summary, we've drafted some agreed upon temporary surplus language for the 2021 school year to support the current hiring timeline. We're going to continue to meet, discuss, and find our way through the complex discussions specific to layoff language, and we expect to present that to the board in March. We acknowledge that during this time, we'll also begin the work to focus on recruitment and engagement as well. And we want the board to know that although we're committed to finding a path toward full agreement specific to surplus and layoff language, that we just may not. We've had 6 months of discussion, and there is a point where, you know, all points of discussion will be exhausted and we'll have to move forward. But we're definitely committed to continuing the discussions and finding a path to get there. We really appreciate the opportunity to work collaboratively. I believe that we've learned a lot, a great deal from one another, and we look forward to the continued conversations. And we really want to, again, prioritize the voices of our teachers of color. So when we think about the timeline going forward, we are going to ask that the board approve the temporary language to surplus specifically for this hiring cycle. And now through early March, we will continue our discussions on layoff and the broader topics that I mentioned. Early to mid-March, we will share our language recommendations with the superintendent. At that time, the superintendent will decide on whether or not he will put forth the recommended language to the board. And if so, the recommended language will be shared at the March operations work group, and then a final vote at the regular board meeting in March. So I will pause there and see if there are questions or comments for Heidi or myself.
Nikki?
So the board still gets to weigh in on it either way or not necessarily? Confused on that.
Yes, in March, we will bring the language back. The superintendent will bring a recommendation, and the board will have an opportunity to discuss that in March.
And we would have a vote, or we're not sure on that?
You will have a vote in March as well.
Cool. Thank you. I really appreciate how well everyone has been working and trying to get along and actually make some progress. I'm really, really impressed with that. And I'm glad that things are going well. This is better than I've seen since I've been on the board. So I really commend everyone involved.
Thank you, Nikki.
I think I saw Ollie and then Ananda.
I think that this is an area, Deirdre, in which I want to show you a great deal of appreciation, because in some ways you're acting as the ambassador of truth and reconciliation around this specific issue. We have to acknowledge that, you know, seniority benefits certain demographics of our community, in part because, you know, we have articles like MMSD just hired the first African-American librarian in the history of the organization, right? So we know that if you've been here longer, you're more likely to be white, that we have a system that has created a dynamic in which people of color are the last people hired and the first people fired, but also in which retaining our folks of color is a challenge, and that surplus adds to that challenge. If you have a school that's really thriving and prioritizing, making sure they have a diverse staff, and then that staff is disassembled through surplus, we've seen that erode folks' desire to stay with the district. And so reconciling some of the things that, you know, really are staples of our history of a district in terms of who we've hired and who we've retained long term, and addressing that we have to change how we do this in order to shift that dynamic. And I don't think that is easy work, but I do think that requires a level of honesty from all of us about what longevity has meant historically in this district and continues to mean unless we do something about it. So I look forward to continuing to have this conversation, and I greatly appreciate the time and diplomacy you have put into this work.
Thank you.
Ananda and then
Actually, go ahead, Savian. I didn't have my hands on. I'll hands up. I'll wait for Savian.
Yeah, I want to echo Ali's comments and really show immense appreciation for the patience you have engaged through this for this work. And related to our conversations earlier, sometimes doing the anti-racist thing, you won't always have consensus on. And so I think it is our duty to push forth anyway, and I'm looking forward to the recommendation come March.
I can go now, Chris. It's really nice going after Savian because he sets up really well. So echoing the immense gratitude and like also the just not just the patience, but like the level of skills to be doing this type of engaging in this type of conversations and negotiations. I think one thing, and that's coming up for me, and then it came up when in our conversations earlier around the equity tool, is that when we're trying to create or undo policies that were supporting status quo, there's always a lot of exceptions, right? It is possible. It's very possible. Almost a guarantee that we'll have unintended consequences happening here. The majority of them, if at all, we won't know until the policies are actually in place. I just really commend my colleagues to engage in those, in just having the space for these conversations, because it is a big change for our district. It does mean, like Savian said, that we are really saying that we need to be doing something different, because everything that we have done, or so much that we have engaged thus far as high level policies and the ways in which we have operated, indicates the level of racism are in our district. And so, we can't just say we're going to be anti-racist and continue to do the same thing. We really needed to be making some significant policy changes. And I think this is one of the examples that, it might not be the most popular, it might not be the thing that people are, sharing or celebrating to the degree that we would like to see, but it is, I think it is a really important piece of work. And I really appreciate you, Deidre, and your staff for engaging. And I really appreciate our teaching staff. They engage into some really courageous discussions around doing things differently and really trying to make some significant changes in our district. So thank you.
Chris?
Yeah, Deirdre, I just want to echo the thanks to you for your really hard work on this and just continuing at it. And I know you probably were not expecting this long of a process, but I know that you were dedicated to making this work and making sure that it was given the collaboration and the discussions that that we thought and that I think you also thought were necessary. So I really appreciate the work that you put into this. One of the questions that I had asked a while back, the last time we talked about this, is if we had found any national models from other districts who have also done this work, because I know that we're not the only district discussing this, the questions about, retention and recruitment of staff of color. And so are there other districts that we have found that are doing this work and might be a good model, or we might be able to learn something from that?
Yeah, we've been looking, Chris. We haven't found anything in particular at this point, which is part of the reason why we want to sort of continue focusing on this work. I mean, we want to do our due diligence and make sure that we're exhausting all of the options and opportunities that we have. So our team is still looking and sort of searching to see if there's something that really is an example of what we might be able to use and offer. So I appreciate the question, and just know we're digging into it and hoping that we'll have something that we can work off of, for sure.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I also want to echo the thanks for this process. I really commend you for the work that you've done so far and the solution you brought us in the short term, which is the 1 year language around surplus. I'm a little bit confused. So we're voting on this temporary surplus language that will last for a year. And then in March, you're bringing us layoff language. Is that also going to be surplus language, or will there be a change to surplus language further down the road?
So if we have the opportunity to bring both, Chris, we'll bring both. But I think it's just really dependent on how far we're able to get. I mean, the goal is really, and I think the place where we've had more complex discussions is really specifically in this layoff area. And we want to be able to really shore that up, knowing that we haven't gotten as far on that. And we have the surplus language sort of as our fail-safe, for lack of a better word. So if we have an opportunity to finalize both of those, we absolutely would bring those back for sure.
Okay. I very much appreciate your putting this in the context of like this is just a piece of a much bigger strategy to recruit and retain teachers of color. And with that in mind, I'm not sure if the district is doing exit interviews with staff. And if you are, it would be really interesting to get some data on why teachers of color are leaving MMSD and how much of that attrition is related to surplus and layoff policy and what else we need to be working on to keep staff of color here.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. Yes, we are doing exit surveys. And, I think part of the challenge that we see with that is very specific to our cultures of engagement at our building levels, right? And so it's sort of sometimes a chicken and an egg kind of thing, where if staff are not feeling like they have a sense of belonging and there's this level of engagement at their school building, they may choose to exit the district and not complete the survey, right? So that's always certainly optional, but we're definitely pushing that out and engaging in one-on-one interviews. So we have core group on our team that is always wanting to have a one-on-one sit down to really learn about that. So the data is coming in. It's probably not as robust as we would like it to be, for the very reasons that if staff are feeling like I don't belong here, I'm out, and I'm not going to provide any feedback because they're exiting without the sense of belonging or wanting to really provide that feedback. So.
And Savian, I saw your hand, but based on what you just said about differences at schools in terms of culture, one concern that I have heard from staff as we move to potentially using educator effectiveness as all or part of a rubric to make decisions is that educator effectiveness is not being implemented equally at all schools. We have some schools where it's being done really well, and some schools where educators either aren't getting evaluated or they feel like their evaluation is more focused on the paperwork than actually on good coaching conversations and good feedback. So I feel like part of moving toward a new way of working is also making sure that we're doing educator effectiveness right very consistently across all of our schools. And I think that in particular could maybe be a piece of helping to improve the culture at our schools for educators of color and making sure they're getting the coaching and support they need to feel like they belong and feel supported. I don't know if you can comment on that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Chris, because we were having the same discussions in our meetings, and really the importance of us as a district. When we talk about fidelity of implementation, I think this is one of the areas where we do need to make sure and have a level of accountability where every teacher is getting the opportunity to get that support. And when we think about the evaluation process, it is very much a growth and development process. And many of our teachers appreciate, want to, and really value that process. And everyone deserves the opportunity to be able to go through that on their cycle. And so we have been having conversations within our handbook committee team specifically about that. We definitely know that it is a concern, and we're working to address that. And we know that has to be an area as a district that that we get better at. We just have to do that, and our teachers deserve it. And we expect that. I mean, if we're going to see improvement in instruction, we need to be able to support teachers being able to grow and develop in that area.
Savian and Dr. Jenkins. Savian, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, related to this conversation, I think this relates a lot to the professional development work from both the union and from the school district in terms of particularly young Black professionals in general, feeling welcome in this city. The microaggressions, the macroaggressions are real. The belittling of Black intelligentsia and agency are real. And we need our partners at the union to step up, and us at the district have to step up on this piece to improve our cultures.
I promise I did not just text him that. Those are my words. But anyway, but to add to that, I just wanted to say, Deidre, publicly, you and your team, you have some other individuals working with you around the language as well. I know the chiefs have been working with you closely as we meet every Friday with MTI. And I know that Ed and Andy both, we've been talking about what does it mean to be anti-racist, and the union themselves are hiring someone to talk about anti-racist work and to collaborate. And we're all being there together. But I think the collaborative problem solving discussions we've been having and some of that work is going to lead to our better relationship in truth. Because when you start talking about doing anti-racist work, you have to talk about it in truth. And I had said earlier in one of our discussions about this anti-racist work, it starts in policy. You know, where are we? Where are you guys going to lead us? That's what it comes to. And then you create this space so anti-racist actions can be taken. And so, Deidre, your ability in my short time to just see the growth between the two groups, we shouldn't be against one another, administration and teachers and parents. We're all one entity. That is true anti-racism when you can stop doing that. But I wanted to tell you, this has been a journey. 1993, I came in the district. This district was wrestling then with racist ideology that was playing out in truth. And so when you ask the question, Chris, about exit interviews, there are two interviews that need to happen. Those who leave and those who choose to stay and continue to face the microaggression. But what about the macroaggression, which we can control ourselves at particular levels? So I just think this is a conversation on the eve of the first female in the United States of America sitting in the White House as a vice president. And she happens to be of African and Asian persuasion. This couldn't be a more needed conversation and evidence that Dr. King on his day and weekend said about us in terms of progress. I think today he would be proud that we even having this discussion, and it's real. It's real. So thank you. Sorry so long on that, but it's just thought I had.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jenkins, for those words. I think they're a beautiful way to close out this conversation. But if there are any last questions or comments, please go ahead and ask them. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. This was a long meeting, although better than last week. I appreciate your everybody's thoughts and comments. I think we are well positioned to move through our budget cycle and to move into the decisions we need to make over the next weeks and months. So on that note, can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved, Ali Muldrow.
I'll second. And I did not know we were in competition, Chris. I'll get you next month. I felt that burn.
All those in favor? Aye. All right. We passes unanimously. We are adjourned. Thank you so much and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, everyone. Bye.